Beneath layers of volcanic ash, an entire Bronze Age city waited in silence for more than 3,000 years. Its streets, painted rooms, food stores, and furniture survived almost untouched, but the people were gone. They had escaped before one of the largest eruptions in human history, leaving behind a world frozen on the edge of destruction. Before we uncover what happened to Akrotiri, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more mysteries from the ancient past. A staircase rises toward a floor that no longer exists. Its lower steps are still there, pale beneath the excavation lights, but above them the building has folded inward, crushed by weight and time. Nearby, a doorway opens into a room where painted lilies once climbed across plaster walls. Storage jars stand along the edges, some still containing traces of grain or oil. Clay cups, cooking vessels, loom weights, stone tools, and fragments of furniture lie where they were left more than 3,000 years ago. There are no bodies in the room, no skeletons beneath fallen beams, no final human gestures frozen in ash. The people are gone. What remains is their world. This is Akrotiri, on the island now called Santorini, and beneath several meters of pumice and volcanic debris it preserves one of the most complete Bronze Age settlements ever found in the Aegean. The place is often compared with Pompeii, but the comparison only goes so far. Pompeii was a Roman city caught in a catastrophe that killed many inhabitants in place. Akrotiri appears different. Its streets, houses, workshops, paintings, and possessions were sealed by eruption. Yet the people themselves seem to have escaped before the final disaster. The volcano destroyed the town, but it did not preserve the simple story of a population surprised without warning. Instead, it left a quieter and more difficult mystery, a city emptied before annihilation, its abandoned rooms preserving evidence of preparation, interruption, and disappearance. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. The first impression is not of ruin alone, but of order. Narrow paved streets run between multi-story buildings built from stone, timber, mud brick, and plaster. Some structures rise 3 levels or more. Windows, doorways, balconies, staircases, drainage channels, and storage areas, and specialized rooms suggest a community that is technically skilled and carefully organized. This is not an isolated village at the edge of the Bronze Age world. It is a prosperous maritime settlement connected to a network stretching across the Aegean and beyond. Imported pottery, raw materials, artistic influences, and objects of exchange reveal contact with Crete, mainland Greece, the Cycladic Islands, Cyprus, and the Eastern Mediterranean. That wider world is compressed here into the silence of sealed rooms. The ash preserves details that normally disappear first. Wooden objects decay, but sometimes leave hollow impressions in hardened volcanic material, allowing archaeologists to reconstruct beds, tables, boxes, and shelving, seeds, grains, pulses, olive pits, and fish remains offer traces of diet. Loom weights and spindle whorls reveal textile work. Storage jars indicate surplus, trade, and household planning. Plaster fragments retain colours that should have vanished long ago, deep reds. Mineral blues, yellow ochres, black outlines, and white backgrounds arranged into scenes of plants, animals, ships, rituals, landscapes, and human figures. These paintings are not merely decoration. They are among the most vivid surviving windows into the imagination of the prehistoric Aegean. In one building, young figures gather saffron crocuses across a rocky landscape. In another, monkeys move through an exotic setting. Elsewhere, fishermen carry their catch, women participate in ceremonial scenes, and ships travel between coastal settlements crowded with architecture, trees, animals, and people. Scholars still debate how literally these images should be read. Some may represent real places, others ritual landscapes, and others symbolic worlds shaped by memory and belief. But they show that Akrotiri's inhabitants see themselves as part of something larger than a single island. Their lives face outward toward the sea. The town does not survive as a neat snapshot of one ordinary afternoon. The record is more complicated. Earthquakes appear to have damaged Akrotiri before the main eruption. Walls cracked or collapsed. Rubble was cleared. Repairs began. Furniture and valuables may have been removed from some rooms. In certain places, Objects seem gathered together as if residents expected to return. This matters because the settlement was not simply overwhelmed at the first sign of danger. There may have been days, weeks, or even longer between damaging tremors and the eruption that finally buried the town. The evidence remains incomplete, and volcanic sequences do not translate easily into a precise human timetable. Still, what survives suggests warning. That warning may explain the absence of bodies, but it creates another problem. An evacuation is only the beginning of a story, not its conclusion. Where did the inhabitants go? Did they leave by boat for nearby islands or Crete? Did they shelter in open areas elsewhere on Thera? Were they later killed by ashfall, collapsing roofs, hot volcanic surges, or tsunamis beyond the excavated town? Did survivors merge into other Aegean communities, carrying memories of the lost island with them? No secure answer has emerged. The missing population remains one of Akrotiri's most haunting features, because the city preserves nearly everything except the people who gave it meaning. The preservation itself is the result of violence. Pumice accumulated over roofs and courtyards. Ash penetrated openings and filled interiors. Walls buckled under pressure. Wooden beams weakened, structures collapsed, and later volcanic material sealed the broken spaces. In some rooms, debris entered gradually enough to hold surfaces and objects in place. In others, destruction was sudden and chaotic. The result is not a city standing untouched, but a compressed archaeological landscape where careful excavation must reverse the process of collapse one layer at a time. That work reveals a strange intimacy. A stack of cups suggests repeated use. A grinding stone speaks of daily food preparation. A doorway worn by movement records countless passages from room to room. Painted plaster, fallen face down, preserves colours because the image was protected by its own collapse. A bed survives only as an empty shape where wood once stood. Such details make Akrotiri feel close, but they also sharpen the distance. Every object belongs to a routine that stopped. Every room waits for inhabitants who never came back. The volcano that buried Akrotiri did more than preserve architecture. It preserved a contradiction. Destruction usually erases the fragile parts of the past and leaves only foundations, broken pottery, and scattered stone. Here, catastrophe protected colour, domestic space, food, furnishings, and the visual language of an entire community. The eruption removed the town from history and, in doing so, saved it from the slower destruction of weather, rebuilding, looting, and ordinary time. Yet the buried city is only the final page of a much longer story. Before the ash, there is an island formed and reformed by fire. Before the abandonment, there are centuries of growth. Before the silence, ships arrive, workshops operate, families climb staircases, painters cover walls, and farmers work beneath a volcanic horizon. To understand why this world is preserved so completely, it is necessary to reconstruct the island that existed before catastrophe. When Thera was not a broken ring around a flooded caldera, but a living Bronze Age landscape whose danger was built into the ground beneath it. Long before Akrotiri becomes a town of painted walls and crowded storerooms, the island beneath it is already the product of repeated destruction. Thera does not begin as a quiet piece of land waiting to be inhabited. It forms within one of the most active volcanic regions of the southern Aegean, where the African tectonic plate sinks beneath the Aegean microplate and feeds a chain of volcanoes stretching across the sea. Over immense spans of time, magma rises through fractured crust. Eruptions build new land, older surfaces collapse, and the shape of the island changes again and again. The Bronze Age inhabitants of Thera live on ground created by earlier catastrophes, though they do not possess the geological language that would make this history visible to them. The modern outline of Santorini can be misleading. Today, the island appears as a broken ring of steep cliffs surrounding a deep flooded basin. White towns cling to the upper edges of dark volcanic walls, and small islands of hardened lava rise from the water near the centre. This caldera is the result of repeated volcanic episodes, including the enormous Bronze Age eruption. But the landscape known to Akrotiri's inhabitants is different. Thera is not yet the dramatic crescent seen today. It is likely a larger, more continuous island, though scholars still debate its exact prehistoric shape. Some reconstructions suggest a broad central volcanic depression or an earlier caldera partly open to the sea. Others propose a more enclosed island with a volcanic centre rising within it. the evidence remains incomplete because much of that Bronze Age terrain has collapsed, eroded, or lies beneath later volcanic deposits and seawater. What is clear is that the island is not barren. Volcanic landscapes can look hostile, especially after eruption. But weathered ash and lava often produce fertile soils. Over generations, the ground supports fields, orchards, pasture, and wild vegetation, barley, wheat, lentils, peas, olives, figs, and grapes can grow in the island's dry Mediterranean climate, though farming depends on careful use of limited water. Rainfall is seasonal, summers are long, and permanent rivers are absent. Moisture from winter rain, morning humidity, and porous volcanic soils becomes precious. The population learns to work within these limits, choosing crops suited to drought and storing what can be preserved. The sea compensates for what the land cannot provide. Fish, shellfish, and marine mammals appear in the visual and material world of the settlement. Boats connect Thera to islands visible on clear days and to more distant shores beyond the horizon. The island occupies a useful position between Crete, the central Cyclades, and the Greek mainland. It is not merely surrounded by water, it is placed inside a maritime highway. Bronze Age sailors do not navigate an empty blue expanse. They move through a familiar seascape of headlands, stars, winds, currents, island silhouettes, and seasonal routes remembered across generations. Natural harbours or sheltered landing places give vessels access to the island, although the precise locations of Bronze Age coastlines remain difficult to reconstruct. The eruption changes shorelines violently, and later erosion, subsidence, and construction further obscure them. Akrotiri lies near the southern coast, positioned to take advantage of movement through the Aegean. Its location allows inhabitants to receive timber, metals, pottery, stone, luxury objects, and ideas from elsewhere. In return, the island may export agricultural products, textiles, craft goods, and perhaps volcanic materials such as pumice. What survives in the record suggests that geography turns a small volcanic island into a place of unusual importance. The landscape around the settlement probably carries signs of older eruptions. Layers of pale pumice and dark lava are exposed in cliffs and gullies. Rounded volcanic hills rise above cultivated ground. Hot springs, unusual smells, tremors, and minor emissions may have reminded inhabitants that the earth beneath them is restless. Yet familiarity can soften danger. A volcano that has been quiet for generations becomes part of the ordinary world. Its slopes become pasture. Its stone becomes building material. Its ash becomes soil. People raise families on terrain formed by events too distant to remember clearly. The island also offers materials that shape its architecture. Builders use local volcanic stone, including dense dark rock and lighter porous material, setting it into walls strengthened with wooden beams. Clay and mud plaster cover rough surfaces. Timber must often be brought from elsewhere or carefully conserved because large trees are limited on a dry island. The resulting buildings are adapted both to local resources and to seismic risk. Wooden elements help walls absorb movement, though no construction can fully resist a major earthquake followed by volcanic burial. Animals move through this landscape alongside people. Sheep and goats graze on scrub and stubble. Pigs and cattle may be kept where resources allow. Donkeys or similar pack animals are less securely documented for every period, and scholars remain cautious when reconstructing their role. Birds gather along coasts and fields. Dolphins and fish enter painted scenes, while monkeys and large cats appear in imagery that may reflect distant lands, imported artistic traditions, or symbolic meaning rather than animals actually living on Thera. The island's visual culture combines close observation of the local nature with knowledge carried from far beyond it. Seasonal rhythms govern life. Winter brings rain, rough seas, and the repair of tools and buildings. Spring covers parts of the island with flowers, including crocuses that later appear in Akrotiri's frescoes. Summer dries the landscape and concentrates activity around harvest, storage, fishing, and travel. Autumn brings preparation for another cycle. These rhythms make the island productive, but they also expose its fragility. A failed rainy season can reduce yields. A blocked sea route can isolate the population. An earthquake can damage storage and shelter. A volcanic crisis can threaten every system at once. The inhabitants do not see themselves as living in a doomed place. That conclusion belongs to those who know what happens later. For most of Akrotiri's history, Thera is a successful home. Children grow up learning its paths and shores. Farmers understand where moisture lingers longest in the soil. Sailors know which winds open the route toward Crete. Craftspeople recognize the qualities of local stone and imported clay. Religious practices likely connect human life to forces of nature. Fertility, sea travel, and renewal, though the surviving evidence does not permit a complete reconstruction of belief. Beneath all of this activity, magma slowly gathers. Geological processes unfold on scales too large and too hidden for the population to follow. Pressure builds within the volcanic system. Rock fractures deep underground. Fluids and gases move through channels that have opened and closed across thousands of years. Nothing in the ordinary routines of farming, building, trade, or ceremony reveals exactly when the island will change again. For now, Thera remains green enough to cultivate, dry enough to demand ingenuity, and connected enough to become prosperous. Its volcanic soil feeds crops. Its position feeds commerce. Its harbours draw ships. The same geological forces that once created the island provide the foundation for a thriving community, while preserving within that foundation the capacity to erase it. From this unstable but advantageous landscape, Akrotiri begins to grow. No longer as a small settlement on the edge of the sea, but as a port increasingly woven into the wealth and movement of the Bronze Age Mediterranean. Akrotiri's rise does not happen in isolation. It grows because the sea around Thera is not a boundary but a road, and by the middle of the Bronze Age that road carries an expanding traffic of ships, cargoes, craftsmen, migrants, and ideas. The settlement stands near the southern edge of the island, close enough to sheltered anchorages and maritime routes to become a natural stopping point between Crete, the Cyclades, mainland Greece, and the eastern Mediterranean. Its prosperity is built less on the size of its fields than on its ability to connect distant places. The earliest settlement is modest, probably beginning as a small farming and fishing community. Archaeological evidence indicates occupation on Thera long before the famous eruption, with houses and pottery belonging to earlier phases of Cycladic life. Over centuries, however, Akrotiri changes character. Buildings become larger, streets become more organized. Storage capacity expands. Imported objects appear in growing numbers. The town begins to resemble not simply a village that occasionally receives foreign goods, but a port actively involved in regional exchange. This transformation takes place during a period when the Aegean is becoming increasingly interconnected. Crete supports powerful palace-centered societies at places such as Knossos, Phaistos, Malea, and Zakros. The Cycladic islands provide stepping stones across the sea. Mainland communities grow in wealth and military strength. Cyprus supplies copper, while tin required for bronze arrives through more distant and uncertain routes. Egypt and the Levant offer luxury goods, technologies, raw materials, and markets. No single kingdom controls all of this movement. Instead, overlapping networks link ports through repeated voyages, personal relationships, seasonal opportunities, and political agreements that are only partly visible in the archaeological record. Akrotiri benefits from sitting near the centre of these networks. Ships travelling north from Crete can reach Thera before continuing toward Melos, Naxos, Kea, or the mainland. Vessels moving south can use the island as a point of rest, exchange, or resupply. Sailors in this period generally remain close to known coastlines and island chains when possible, though they're capable of crossing open water. A journey depends on weather, wind, currents, crew experience, and the reliability of the vessel. Ports offering fresh water, food, repairs, storage, and trustworthy contacts become valuable far beyond their physical size. The town's merchants or administrators appear to understand this advantage. Large jars hold oil, grain, wine, pulses, and other commodities. Standardized containers make goods easier to store and transport. Sealings and marks may help identify ownership, origin, destination, or quantity. Although scholars still debate how formal Akrotiri's accounting systems are, the settlement has not produced a great palace archive like those known from later Aegean centres. But trade can flourish without a single centralized bureaucracy. It may depend on prominent households, merchant families, local officials, religious institutions, or some combination of them. Imported pottery provides one of the clearest signs of connection. Vessels from Crete arrive alongside wares from other Cycladic islands and mainland regions. Their shapes and painted styles reveal changing tastes as well as changing relationships. Some containers reach Akrotiri carrying goods, others are valued for their craftsmanship or social meaning. Local potters imitate foreign forms, adapt them, and combine them with island traditions. Trade therefore moves more than objects. It carries habits of dining, storage, display, and ritual. Metal is even more important. Thera has no rich source of copper or tin, yet bronze tools and weapons belong to the technological world in which Akrotiri participates. Copper may arrive from Cyprus or other eastern sources, while tin travels through long-distance networks that remain one of the great unresolved problems of Bronze Age archaeology. The exact route of every shipment cannot be reconstructed. But the presence of metal objects shows that island communities depend on exchange extending far beyond visible horizons. A broken supply chain can affect tools, ship fittings, craft production, and status goods. Access to metal is therefore both economic and political. Obsidian from Melos offers another example. This dark volcanic glass has circulated through the Aegean since the Neolithic period. It can be shaped into exceptionally sharp blades and is recognizable by its geological signature. Even after bronze becomes more common, obsidian remains useful for cutting and scraping. Its presence at Akrotiri connects the town to an older maritime tradition, showing that Bronze Age commerce builds upon routes travelled for thousands of years. Thera likely exports products of its own. Agricultural goods such as wine, oil, pulses, and grain are possible. Although the island's limited land places natural limits on volume, textiles may be more important than their archaeological visibility suggests. Wool, flax, dyes, skilled labour, and weaving equipment can produce valuable cloth that leaves the little direct trace once it decays. Fine pottery and crafted objects may also travel outward. Pumice, useful as an abrasive and construction material, is another likely commodity. What survives in the record suggests a flexible economy rather than dependence on a single export. Ships themselves become symbols of wealth and identity. Seafaring demands timber, rope, sails, tools, trained crews, provisions, and knowledge. A vessel represents a considerable investment, and ownership may belong to powerful households or partnerships rather than ordinary individuals. Successful voyages can return with copper, pottery, ivory, pigments, spices, oils, precious materials, and information. Failed voyages can disappear without leaving evidence. The sea creates opportunity, but it never becomes safe. The growth of trade reshapes the settlement. Warehouses and storerooms become essential. Workshops process raw materials. Labourers unload cargoes and carry jars through narrow streets. Scribes or record keepers may track transactions. Sailmakers, carpenters, potters, metalworkers, fishermen, farmers, and merchants depend on one another. Foreign visitors arrive with unfamiliar clothing, languages, and customs. Some stay only long enough to exchange cargo, others may settle, marry, teach techniques, or serve as intermediaries between communities. Cretan influence becomes especially visible. Artistic styles, pottery forms, religious imagery, and perhaps administrative practices link Akrotiri closely with the Minoan world, yet it would be misleading to describe the town simply as a Cretan colony. Its material culture remains distinctly Cycladic, and local traditions continue alongside imported ones. The relationship may involve admiration, economic dependence, political alliance, migration, or unequal influence. But no single explanation fully accounts for the mixture. Akrotiri belongs to a shared Aegean culture while retaining its own identity. Wealth also creates differences within the town. Some buildings are larger, more elaborately decorated, and better supplied than others. Certain households possess imported vessels and fine objects that signal access to distant networks. Yet the absence of obvious royal palaces or monumental tombs makes Akrotiri's social hierarchy difficult to define. Power may be distributed among several elite families rather than concentrated in one ruler. Religious authority, control of storage, ownership of ships, and connections with foreign ports may all contribute to status. By the final generations before the eruption, Akrotiri has become a place where the wider Bronze Age world arrives daily. Copper from afar becomes tools in local workshops. imported jars are emptied and reused. Sailors bring reports of harvests, conflict, storms, and political change. Foreign artistic forms are copied onto local walls. Goods pass through storerooms toward destinations beyond Thera. The town's success rests on movement, and movement gives it a confidence visible in its increasingly ambitious architecture. Akrotiri is no longer merely surviving on a volcanic island. It is flourishing because it has learned how to turn location into influence. Its streets grow busier, its houses rise higher, and its inhabitants surround themselves with objects and images drawn from across the sea. The settlement's next transformation takes place within those buildings, where wealth, belief, work, and private life are preserved in a level of detail rarely granted to the ancient world. Inside Akrotiri's houses, prosperity becomes visible not through thrones or monumental statues, but through space, colour, storage, and the careful organisation of daily life. The town's buildings rise tightly beside one another along narrow paved streets, their upper floors supported by walls of stone, mud brick, timber, and plaster. Some structures contain dozens of rooms arranged around staircases, corridors, light wells, workshops, storerooms, and reception areas from the street. Their exteriors may have appeared solid and restrained. Within them, however, walls open into painted landscapes, elegant chambers, shelves of pottery, and rooms designed for purposes that archaeologists still cannot always identify with confidence. The height of these buildings is remarkable. In many Bronze Age settlements, only foundations survive, leaving researchers to imagine everything above waist level. At Akrotiri, volcanic material preserves substantial portions of walls and, in some places, traces of multiple stories. Staircases reveal that vertical space matters. Lower levels tend to contain storage, food preparation, craft activity, or service areas, while upper rooms often receive more light and sometimes more elaborate decoration. This does not mean every building follows the same rigid plan. Houses change over generations. Walls are added, doors are blocked, floors are repaired, and rooms take on new functions. Akrotiri is not constructed at once according to a single design. It grows through repeated decisions made by families, builders, craftsmen, and perhaps local authorities. Timber is built into the masonry, creating horizontal and vertical frames that help support walls during earthquakes. This technique reflects long experience with unstable ground. Builders know that stone alone can crack and collapse when the earth moves. Wood gives structures a degree of flexibility, although the system has limits. The earthquakes before the eruption damage even well-built houses, and the final weight of pumice eventually crushes roofs and floors. Still, the architecture shows that seismic danger is not an unfamiliar surprise. It is a problem the community has tried to manage for generations. The streets between the buildings are narrow enough to hold shade during the hottest parts of the day. Their paving stones slope around corners and entrances, directing movement through a dense urban landscape. Beneath or beside them, drainage channels carry wastewater away from houses. Some buildings contain clay pipes or vertical conduits connected to upper floors. Scholars still debate exactly how advanced the sanitation system was and whether every channel served sewage, rainwater, or household waste. But the engineering is far more sophisticated than the image of a primitive island village would suggest. Water itself remains scarce, so the settlement must handle it carefully. Wells, jars, collection methods, and imported supplies may all have played a role, though the evidence remains incomplete. Doors lead into rooms crowded with pottery. Large pithoi, some nearly as tall as a person, stand against walls or sink partly into floors. They store grain, oil, wine, pulses, dried foods, and perhaps raw materials for workshops. Smaller vessels are used for pouring, mixing, drinking, cooking, and serving. Their shapes reveal habits of movement and consumption: narrow necks for controlled pouring, broad bowls for shared food, strainers for processing liquids, tripods for cooking above heat. Pottery is so common that it can seem ordinary, but every vessel represents labour. Clay must be gathered, cleaned, shaped, dried, fired, transported, and sometimes painted. A large household collection reflects not only wealth, but an entire system of production. Some rooms are filled with loom weights and spindle whirls, evidence of textile manufacture, Wool or flax is spun into thread, stretched across upright looms, woven into cloth, dyed, cut, repaired, and reused. Textiles are among the most valuable products of many ancient economies, yet they rarely survive. At Akrotiri, the tools remain while the fabric disappears, leaving archaeologists to reconstruct an industry from small pieces of clay and stone. The scale of equipment in certain spaces suggests production beyond the immediate needs of one family. Cloth may be made for exchange, tribute, ritual, or the outfitting of ships. A sail alone requires an enormous quantity of woven material and repeated maintenance. Food preparation takes place in rooms marked by grinding stones, hearths, cooking pots, storage bins, animal bones, and plant remains. Barley and wheat are ground into flour. Lentils and peas are stored as dependable sources of nourishment. Fish are cleaned, dried, or cooked. Olives and grapes are processed. Meat is less common in the daily diet than artistic scenes of abundance might imply, and livestock also provide milk, wool, traction, dung, and social value. Meals vary by household wealth, season, and access to trade. The people of Akrotiri live in a prosperous port, but prosperity does not eliminate the practical labour of preparing food every day. Light enters through windows, doorways, and open spaces, but many ground floor rooms remain dim. Oil lamps extend activity after sunset, casting small flames against plastered walls. Smoke, cooking odours, damp storage areas, animals, salt air, and crowded streets would make the town smell very different from the clean archaeological sites seen today. Bronze Age life is colourful and technically accomplished, but it is not polished or scentless. Floors collect dust. Walls require repair. Insects reach stored grain. Roofs leak. Fires must be watched. A multi-story house can display wealth while still demanding constant maintenance. The most striking interiors are those covered with frescoes. Artists apply pigments to prepared plaster, sometimes while the surface remains damp, allowing colour to bind more securely. Mineral reds, yellows, blacks, whites, and blues create figures and landscapes with confident flowing lines. The famous blue pigment may include imported materials or carefully manufactured compounds, linking artistic production to long-distance trade and specialized knowledge. Painters work across large wall surfaces, planning scenes around doorways, corners, shelves, and our architectural features. Some designs may be created by local artists trained in Aegean traditions. Others reveal close connections with Cretan styles. In the House of the Ladies, elegantly dressed women appear within a carefully composed interior scene. Their clothing, jewellery, hairstyles, and gestures suggest status and possibly ritual activity. In the Zeste 3 building, saffron gatherers move among crocuses growing across a rocky landscape. One figure appears to offer the flowers to a seated female presence associated with animals and attendants. The scene may represent religious ceremony, healing, fertility, initiation, or several meanings at once. Saffron is not merely decorative, it can serve as a dye, perfume, spice, medicine, and valuable trade product. Its appearance in such a prominent painted program suggests that a familiar plant carries economic and sacred importance. Elsewhere, fishermen hold strings of freshly caught fish. Their bodies are shown with an economy of line that makes them appear almost weightless against the wall. They may be ordinary workers, ritual participants, or idealized figures offering their catch. The distinction is difficult to recover. Ancient images do not function like photographs. They select, arrange, exaggerate, and symbolize. Yet the fishermen still preserve something immediate: the physical confidence of people who understand the sea and depend upon it. The most ambitious painted composition is the miniature frieze often called the flotilla fresco. Ships move between settlements crowded with buildings, people, animals, trees, and shoreline activity. Some vessels are paddled, others seem prepared for sail. Cabins, decorations, and crews suggest ships serving different purposes. The scene has been interpreted as a festival, a ceremonial voyage, a military expedition, a remembered journey, or an idealized map of the maritime world. No single explanation fully accounts for every detail. What survives in the record suggests that ships are not merely tools of trade, they are central to identity, display, and collective memory. The houses therefore reveal far more than comfortable domestic life. They show a town in which work, Religion, trade, status, and beauty overlap. A storeroom can support commerce. A painted chamber can host ceremony. A staircase can separate public and private activity. A workshop can belong to a household whose wealth depends on distant ports. Akrotiri's residents do not divide life into modern categories of home, office, temple, and factory. Their buildings gather these functions together. The walls also expose inequality. Not every resident lives among elaborate frescoes. Some buildings are larger, more carefully finished, and more richly supplied than others. Certain households control storage, imported goods, specialized labor, and prominent spaces. Yet the town lacks an unmistakable royal palace dominating everything around it. Power may be shared among several influential families or institutions. Wealth is present, hierarchy is visible. But the precise political structure remains uncertain. By the time the houses reach their fullest form, Akrotiri has become a city of surfaces and hidden systems. Beneath painted rooms lie storerooms. Behind ceremonial images stand workshops and kitchens. Below paved streets run channels carrying waste and water. Within the walls, timber braces stone against earthquakes. Every part of the town reflects adaptation to trade, to scarcity, to social ambition, and to the restless island beneath it. The eruption will preserve these arrangements with extraordinary clarity, but before the disaster arrives, the objects inside the houses begin to reveal the people themselves, their labor, their diet, their distinctions, their rituals, and the private patterns of a society that left no written history explaining who it believed itself to be. The people of Akrotiri left no surviving historical account that names their rulers, describes their laws, or explains the meaning of the images painted across their walls. Their writing, where it appears, is limited and remains unreadable, because the script belongs to the undeciphered family of Aegean signs known as Linear A. The town must therefore be understood indirectly, through objects that were never intended to serve as testimony. A fishbone, a broken spindle, a repaired jar, or the imprint of a wooden bed can reveal more about ordinary life than a monument celebrating a king. Taken together, these traces suggest a society whose prosperity depends not only on maritime trade, but on disciplined labor, specialized knowledge, careful storage, and an intimate understanding of an unpredictable environment. Food remains provide one of the clearest paths into that world. Grain is central. Barley and wheat are grown on Thera or brought from elsewhere, then stored in large jars and ground on heavy stone querns. The work is repetitive and physically demanding. Grain must be cleaned, crushed, mixed with water, and transformed into bread, porridge, or other simple meals. Pulses such as lentils, peas, and beans add protein and can be dried for long storage. Figs, grapes, olives, and almonds broaden the diet. While herbs and spices may provide flavor and medicinal value, some products are seasonal luxuries, others are reserves against poor harvests and interrupted trade. The sea supplies fish in greater variety than the famous frescoes alone suggest. Small fish can be caught close to shore, while larger species require stronger lines, nets, boats, and deeper water knowledge. Shellfish are gathered from rocky coasts. Fish may be eaten fresh, dried in the sun, salted, or processed for storage, though the precise techniques used at Akrotiri remain uncertain. The fishermen shown carrying their catch may represent ritual offerings, but the image is grounded in practical familiarity. The painter understands the shape and weight of marine animals, and the community understands where they can be found. Animal bones reveal sheep, goats, pigs, and cattle, but meat is unlikely to have been equally or available to everyone. Livestock are valuable while alive. Sheep provide wool, goats provide milk and survive on poor grazing, cattle contribute strength and status, and pigs efficiently transform household waste into food. Slaughter may be concentrated around ceremonies of feasts or moments when animals can no longer serve another purpose. The distribution of particular cuts between buildings may expose social distinctions, although preservation and excavation make such patterns difficult to interpret. What survives in the record suggests that shared meals could reinforce rank as easily as community. The management of food requires knowledge extending well beyond cooking. Farmers must read the seasons, recognize changes in wind, judge soil moisture, and decide when to sow or harvest. Stored grain must be protected from insects, rodents, mold, and damp. Oil and wine need secure containers. Dried goods must survive the winter, on an island where drought is always possible. Waste carries serious consequences. Prosperity is therefore not simply the result of fertile volcanic soil. It depends on generations of accumulated environmental experience. Pottery reveals the scale of that management. Large pithoi hold household reserves or commercial goods, while smaller jars, cups, bowls, strainers, jugs, cooking pots, and ritual vessels serve more specialized functions. Some are plain and heavily used, others carry painted spirals, plants, birds, marine creatures, or geometric patterns. Repairs appear on vessels valuable enough to keep after cracking. Small holes may be drilled along a break so the fragments can be tied together, extending the life of an object that modern observers might dismiss as easily replaced. Clay is common, but skilled labor is not free. The distribution of vessels also hints at social performance. Fine cups and pouring jars may be used when guests gather, when agreements are negotiated, or when ceremonies require controlled serving. Drinking together can express hospitality, alliance, hierarchy, and belonging. The person who owns imported pottery demonstrates connections beyond the island. The person who controls a storeroom controls the ability to feed others when supplies are scarce. Even an ordinary jar can become part of a system of authority. Tools make that system visible. Stone blades, bronze knives, chisels, saws, hooks, needles, awls, weights, and grinding equipment belong to different forms of labor. Some are found in rooms clearly associated with workshops, while others appear inside domestic spaces where several activities overlap. Metal tools are valuable because their raw material must travel through long exchange networks. Broken bronze can be melted and reshaped. Ownership of a specialized tool may identify a craftsperson, but it can also represent a household investment passed through generations. Textile production is especially revealing because the finished material has almost entirely vanished. Loom weights preserve the lower tension of upright looms. Spindle whorls show where fibers were twisted into thread. Needles and small tools point towards sewing, finishing, and repair. Producing cloth requires enormous amounts of time. Wool must be collected, washed, sorted, combed, spun, woven, dyed, and fitted to its purpose. Fine garments displayed in the frescoes are therefore not casual decorations. They represent control over animals, pigments, labor, and specialized skill. Clothing also communicates identity. Painted women wear layered garments with elaborate patterns and fitted forms. Jewelry surrounds necks, wrists, and ears. Hairstyles may indicate age, rank, or stages of life. Some young figures have partially shaved heads, a convention seen elsewhere in the Aegean and often interpreted as marking youth. Yet scholars still debate whether these images represent ordinary inhabitants, elite participants in ceremonies, divine figures, or idealized social types. The paintings show how people wish to present bodies and status, not necessarily how everyone appeared while grinding grain or unloading ships. Furniture impressions bring the society closer still. Beds, tables, stools, chests, shelves, and partitions are reconstructed from cavities left when wood decayed inside hardened ash. Because timber is scarce and often imported, wooden furniture may represent considerable expense. Skilled carpenters shape joints, surfaces, and supports without modern tools. A decorated chest can hold textiles, ritual objects, or valuables. A bed separates certain inhabitants from those sleeping on mats or simple platforms. Domestic comfort, like food and clothing, is unevenly distributed. Religious imagery offers more questions than answers. Female figures appear prominently, sometimes associated with animals, flowers, altars, or attendants. Saffron gatherers move through a landscape in what may be an initiation ritual or an offering connected with healing, fertility, menstruation, or seasonal renewal. Horn-shaped symbols, libation vessels, and offering tables link Akrotiri to broader Aegean practices. There is no clear evidence for a single organized religion with a fixed hierarchy, and the absence of a monumental temple complicates interpretation. Ritual may occur inside prominent buildings, household rooms, open courtyards, or spaces combining sacred and civic purposes. Nature is never far from these ceremonies. Crocuses grow from painted rocks, swallows dart across walls, dolphins leap through the sea, monkeys climb among unfamiliar landscapes. a large feline appears in a scene that may refer to distant Africa or the eastern Mediterranean. These animals could carry symbolic meanings, but they also reveal the breadth of knowledge reaching Thera. Some species are observed locally, others are known through imported objects, stories, travellers, or artistic models. Akrotiri's residents inhabit a small island while imagining a much larger world. The flotilla fresco brings many of these elements together. Ships move between populated coastlines while people watch from buildings and gather along the shore. The vessels are decorated and carefully arranged, suggesting that the journey is more than routine commerce. It may represent a festival, diplomatic procession, military return, seasonal voyage, or mythic event. The settlements in the painting may be real ports, remembered places, or idealized combinations. The evidence remains incomplete, but the scene makes one conviction unmistakable. The sea is central to the community's understanding of itself. Akrotiri's society is therefore preserved not as a list of rulers and wars, but as a network of dependencies. Farmers rely on stored water and predictable seasons. Weavers rely on shepherds and dyers. Sailors rely on carpenters, rope makers, and merchants. Elite households rely on labour that remains largely anonymous. Ritual specialists rely on food, textiles, pigments, and spaces supplied by others. The painted walls celebrate beauty and ceremony, while the objects beneath them reveal the work required to sustain both. For generations, this arrangement succeeds. Goods continue to move, houses rise, and storerooms remain full enough to support a sophisticated town. Yet the same objects that reveal stability also show preparation for uncertainty, reserves against hunger, timber against earthquakes, repaired vessels against scarcity, and ships ready to cross the sea. Akrotiri's people understand many dangers of island life. The danger gathering beneath their feet, however, is beginning to exceed anything their social knowledge can contain. The first signs may have seemed familiar: a tremor beneath the floor, cups rattling on a shelf, dust loosening from plaster, animals becoming restless for reasons no one could explain. In a region where earthquakes are part of life, one movement of the ground does not immediately announce the end of a world. The inhabitants of Akrotiri build with earthquakes in mind, reinforce walls with timber, repair cracks, and continue living. Yet at some point in the final phase of the town, the shaking becomes strong enough to break that confidence. Walls split, upper floors sag, masonry falls into streets, doorways twist out of alignment, staircases crack, and roofs partially collapse. In some buildings, entire rooms become unusable. The damage is not evenly distributed, because earthquakes rarely move through a settlement with perfect consistency. One house may lose a wall while another remains mostly intact. Loose stone falls first. Heavy storage jars tip or shatter, lamps, cups, and tools tumble from shelves. Dust fills the narrow streets, turning familiar passages into corridors of debris. For archaeologists, these earthquake traces are difficult to separate from the destruction caused by the eruption itself. Both events crack walls, bury rooms, and collapse buildings. Yet there are clues that at least one major earthquake strikes before the volcanic burial. Rubble appears cleared from certain spaces. Damaged walls show signs of repair. Objects are moved from unstable rooms. Temporary arrangements suggest that inhabitants return after the shaking and begin trying to restore the settlement. This interval between earthquake and eruption becomes one of the most important pieces of Akrotiri's final story. The exact duration of that interval remains uncertain. It may have lasted days, weeks, or possibly longer. Different buildings may preserve different moments of the crisis, and later volcanic deposits disturbed many of the earlier traces. No calendar survives. No written account records how long families slept outdoors, how quickly craftsmen began rebuilding, or when the first residents decided that remaining on the island was too dangerous. What survives in the records suggests neither immediate panic nor complete calm. It suggests a community attempting to respond to damage without understanding what the damage means. After the first major shock, people likely gather in open spaces away from unstable walls. Injuries would be expected, though no human remains securely linked to this stage have been found within the excavated town. Fires may have broken out where hearths or lamps overturned. Water containers could have shattered at precisely the moment they were most needed. Stored food may have been buried under collapsed ceilings. Families would search for relatives, tools, animals, and valuables while aftershocks continued beneath them. The sound alone must have been terrifying. Stone grinding against stone, wooden beams cracking, pottery breaking in storerooms, roof tiles and plaster striking floors, dogs barking, livestock struggling, and voices carrying through dust. Yet earthquakes do not explain themselves. The inhabitants have no instruments to measure the movement, and no scientific model linking tremors to magma rising beneath the island. They may interpret the event through inherited beliefs, divine displeasure, local tradition, or practical experience. Religious ceremonies could be performed, but the evidence cannot reveal which prayers, offerings, or explanations shaped their response. Earthquakes are common enough in the Aegean that rebuilding is a rational decision. Abandoning a prosperous home after every tremor would make settled life impossible. Akrotiri's position within regional trade, its warehouses, fields, workshops, and houses represent generations of investment. Leaving means surrendering property, stored food, social standing, and access to familiar networks. Even people who fear another shock have powerful reasons to remain nearby. They begin clearing the streets, broken stone is piled aside, usable timber is recovered, fallen plaster is removed from rooms, damaged vessels are sorted, and intact goods are carried to safer locations. Some buildings may be entered only long enough to retrieve valuables. Others are stabilized for repair. This work requires cooperation. Heavy stones must be moved by teams. Upper floors must be inspected. Food and water must be shared while ordinary household systems remain disrupted. One surprising detail is the apparent presence of beds or sleeping platforms placed outdoors or in cleared spaces. These may indicate that residents avoid sleeping inside damaged buildings, fearing aftershocks. Such behavior is common after destructive earthquakes even today. People remain close to their homes to protect possessions and continue repairs, but they do not trust the walls around them. Akrotiri may briefly become a town whose inhabitants live beside their houses rather than inside them. The earthquake also disrupts trade. Ships may hesitate to approach damaged harbours. Warehouses cannot operate normally. Cargoes waiting for export may be trapped beneath debris. Imported food and materials become harder to obtain. If coastal facilities are damaged, the settlement's greatest advantage, its connection to the sea, weakens at the very moment it is most needed. Still, boats also offer the clearest route of escape, and decisions about which vessels remain available may become increasingly important. Meanwhile, the volcanic system continues changing below the island. Magma moving upward forces surrounding rock apart, producing earthquakes. Gases expand. Pressure increases within chambers and fractures beneath Thera. Some tremors may be tectonic, others directly volcanic, and the distinction would be invisible to the people experiencing them. Modern volcanologists use earthquake patterns, gas chemistry, ground deformation, and temperature changes to recognize unrest. Akrotiri's inhabitants possess only their senses and memories. They may notice other warnings. Springs could change temperature or taste. Wells might become cloudy or fail. Strong odours resembling sulphur may drift across parts of the island. Small landslides could break from slopes. The sea might behave strangely near the coast. Birds and animals may move unpredictably, though claims about animal warnings are difficult to verify even in modern disasters. None of these signs alone proves that a catastrophic eruption is imminent. Together, however, they may create a growing sense that the island is no longer behaving as it should. The volcano does not necessarily announce itself with a single dramatic column of smoke. Unrest can unfold through pauses and renewed activity. Hours of shaking may be followed by quiet. A calm morning can encourage people to return to work, only for another tremor to strike after dark. This irregular rhythm is dangerous because it allows hope and fear to alternate. Some residents may believe the worst has passed. Others may begin moving children, food, and portable wealth toward the coast. Social differences shape these choices. Wealthy households may control ships, storage, and distant contacts. Merchants can seek shelter with partners on another island. Labourers, servants, craftspeople, and farmers may have fewer options. A vessel has limited space, and an evacuation by sea requires order, weather, crews, and destinations willing to receive newcomers. The absence of bodies at Akrotiri suggests that many people leave the town itself. but it does not prove that everyone escapes the wider disaster. The earthquake damage preserved beneath the eruption shows a society caught between repair and departure. Some objects remain neatly stored, others are gathered in unusual places. Tools used for rebuilding are abandoned. Streets appear cleared enough for movement, while damaged rooms stand empty. The town has not been deserted for years. Dust and decay have not reclaimed it. Nor does it look like a settlement continuing ordinary life. It is suspended in an emergency. As the tremors continue, the meaning of each new shock changes. At first, it is damage to be repaired. Then it becomes a warning to stay outside. Eventually, it may become a reason to leave. The people of Akrotiri cannot know the scale of what is forming beneath them, but they know enough to recognize that the familiar rules of island life are failing. Walls built to flex have broken. Streets built for commerce are filled with rubble. Storerooms meant to protect the future have become traps beneath unstable floors. The settlement begins to empty, perhaps gradually, perhaps in several waves. Families carry what they can. Boats depart from the coast. Valuable objects disappear from some rooms, while heavy jars and furniture remain. The city is not yet buried, and the volcano has not reached its most violent phase. There is still time to act, but no one knows how much. Between the earthquake and the eruption lies a narrow interval in which thousands of individual decisions determine who leaves, what is saved, and what will remain behind when the sky finally darkens. In the final interval before the eruption, Akrotiri becomes a place arranged around uncertainty. The streets are no longer simply routes between houses and workshops. They are passages through damaged buildings, temporary storage areas, work zones, and possible escape corridors. People move through them carrying baskets, tools, food, cloth, and containers that can be transported without slowing a journey. Heavy objects remain behind. Large storage jars, stone equipment, fixed furniture. And bulky household goods are too difficult to remove quickly. What can be carried begins to matter more than what is valuable in ordinary times. This selective abandonment is one of the clearest clues left by the town. Archaeologists find rooms filled with pottery and supplies, yet objects of concentrated wealth are comparatively scarce. Precious metals, personal ornaments, portable seals, weapons, and other easily transported valuables are not present in the quantities that might be expected from such a prosperous community. Their absence does not prove an organized evacuation. Because valuable materials are always vulnerable to ancient recycling, later disturbance, and incomplete excavation. Still, the pattern suggests that residents had enough warning to take at least some possessions with them. They do not strip the town completely. Everyday objects remain everywhere because ordinary life contains far more material than anyone can rescue. Cooking pots sit in work areas. Loom weights remain where cloth had been woven. Storage jars stand against walls, some full or partly full. Stone mortars and grinding equipment are abandoned because they are nearly impossible to move over rubble or load efficiently into small boats. Furniture is left in upper rooms, beds, tables, stools, and wooden chests survive only through impressions after the timber decays, silent evidence of households that expect either to return or have no choice but to leave them. Food preparation may continue during the crisis. People still need bread, water, and meals while sleeping outside damaged houses or waiting for transport. Grain must be ground even as tremors interrupt the work. Fires must be lit carefully near unstable structures. Portable provisions may be assembled from dried pulses, grain, oil, wine, figs, and salted or dried fish. These foods travel better than fresh produce and require little preparation. A family leaving by sea cannot carry an entire storeroom, so survival depends on choosing supplies that offer the greatest value for their weight. The number of boats available becomes a serious constraint. Akrotiri's identity is maritime, but a trading town does not necessarily possess enough seaworthy vessels to move its entire population at once. Some ships may already be away on voyages, others may have been damaged by earthquakes or by changes along the coast. Large cargo vessels need crews and favourable conditions. Smaller boats can make short crossings but carry fewer people and less water if evacuation unfolds over several days. Ships may move back and forth between Thera and neighbouring islands. If the warning period is shorter, every departure becomes final. The destination remains unknown. The closest islands offer temporary refuge, but they also have limited water and food. Crete lies farther south and contains major settlements with which Akrotiri has strong connections. Other Cycladic communities may receive relatives, trading partners, or strangers arriving with stories of a restless island. No surviving document records such arrivals. Refugees disappear archaeologically when they enter communities using similar pottery, clothing, language, and customs. A household from Thera could settle elsewhere in the Aegean without leaving an unmistakable signature. Some residents may not leave the island at all. They could move away from damaged buildings and volcanic centres toward open ground, believing that distance from walls is enough. Earthquake experience teaches people to avoid collapsing structures, not necessarily to flee across the sea. If the volcano has not erupted catastrophically within living memory, no one can fully imagine what is coming. Families may retreat to fields, coastal camps, or higher areas with blankets and provisions, waiting for the tremors to end. Such a choice is sensible during an earthquake and disastrous during a major explosive eruption. The signals probably become harder to ignore. Tremors may grow more frequent. Fine dust may rise from disturbed slopes. Cracks open in roads or fields. Coastal springs change, and unfamiliar smells drift across the island. Small explosions or steam emissions may occur near vents, though the surviving geological evidence does not allow every preliminary event to be reconstructed. Scholars still debate whether the eruption begins shortly after the major earthquake, or whether a longer pause allows repairs and evacuation to continue. Estimates depend on how debris layers, building activity, and volcanic deposits are interpreted. Akrotiri's inhabitants do not need to understand magma to recognize escalation. A single earthquake can be endured. Repeated shaking, altered water, damaged buildings, and signs of activity from the volcanic center create a different kind of fear. The crisis stops looking temporary. Work on permanent repairs becomes less rational. People shift from restoring homes to preserving lives and movable resources. Inside some buildings, vessels and tools appear gathered together rather than left in their usual positions. Such arrangements may reflect salvage operations. Residents enter damaged rooms, collect useful objects, and move them toward accessible areas. They may be preparing cargo for departure, consolidating supplies, or protecting possessions from further collapse. Yet interpretation remains uncertain. Archaeologists see only the final arrangement, not the sequence of choices that produced it. A group of jars near a doorway could indicate evacuation, cleanup, storage, or work interrupted by another tremor. The emotional character of the settlement can only be inferred. There is likely fear, but also exhaustion. After repeated nights outdoors and days spent clearing debris, urgency becomes part of routine. People wait for relatives to return from the fields or coast. Merchants argue over cargo space. Craftspeople abandon work that cannot be completed. Older residents may resist leaving homes built by their families. Parents try to move children through streets where walls could fall without warning. Those with authority must decide whether to order departure, organize boats, guard supplies, or remain behind. Akrotiri offers no evidence of widespread violence or panic inside the town. There are no streets filled with victims crushed while fleeing, no stores obviously broken open by desperate crowds, and no concentrated groups trapped in public spaces. This absence may indicate that departure is gradual and relatively orderly. It may also reflect the limited area excavated. Much of the ancient settlement remains buried, and the shoreline used for evacuation has not been securely identified. The missing evidence may still lie beneath pumice, modern buildings, the sea, or parts of the island destroyed during caldera collapse. Animals present another problem. Livestock cannot all be loaded onto boats, especially if vessels are scarce. Sheep and goats may be driven away from damaged buildings or released. Valuable animals might be taken aboard larger ships, but cattle and pigs are difficult passengers during an emergency. Pets, working animals, and herds become part of the human calculation. Their remains are also surprisingly limited within the excavated town, perhaps indicating that many were moved before burial. As more residents depart, familiar sounds fade, workshops stop, grinding stones fall silent. The harbour handles fewer commercial cargoes and more people carrying personal bundles. Doors remain open in damaged buildings. Food sits in jars that no longer protect anyone. Frescoes watch over empty rooms while aftershocks send fragments of plaster to the floor. The town still stands. but its social life is withdrawing from it. Then the crisis crosses a threshold. The volcanic system opens a path to the surface. Pressure that has accumulated underground begins to escape through expanding gas and fragmented magma. The first visible activity may not yet resemble the enormous eruption reconstructed by geologists. It could begin with steam, ash, or small explosions, offering one last warning. Those still near Akrotiri see a column rising above the island and understand that the danger is no longer hidden beneath the ground. By this point, the settlement is largely empty, though no one can say whether every inhabitant has left or whether some remain elsewhere on Thera. Boats may already be crossing darkening water. Families may watch from distant shores. Others may be waiting in temporary camps, believing themselves far enough away. Behind them, Akrotiri stands open and vulnerable, its rooms holding everything too heavy, too ordinary, or too hastily abandoned to save. The earthquake has damaged the city, but it has also given its people time. Whether that warning saves them remains unknown. The final traces show preparation without resolution, departure without destination, and a community moving just ahead of a catastrophe whose true scale has not yet revealed itself. Above the volcanic centre, the rising column grows darker, and the first pumice begins to fall. The first pumice does not fall like ordinary rain. It drifts from a darkening sky in pale fragments, light enough to float on water and sharp enough to sting exposed skin. At first, the pieces may seem almost harmless, scattered across roofs, fields, and abandoned streets. Then the fall thickens. The daylight fades behind an expanding volcanic column, and the island disappears beneath a storm created from its own interior. What begins as warning becomes transformation. Deep below Thera, gas dissolved within rising magma expands violently as pressure decreases. The molten rock cannot contain it. Magma fragments into ash, pumice, and hot particles that are driven upward at enormous speed. A towering column forms over the vent, carrying volcanic material high into the atmosphere. Winds spread ash far beyond the island, while heavier fragments fall close to the source. The eruption is not a single explosion, but a sequence of phases, each changing the landscape in a different way. Geologists reconstruct these stages from layers preserved in cliffs and excavations, though the exact duration of each remains debated. During the early phase, pumice begins accumulating across Akrotiri. Roofs, courtyards, streets, and open rooms receive a growing blanket of pale material. Because pumice is full of gas bubbles, individual pieces are light, but millions of them create crushing weight. Roofs already weakened by earthquakes become increasingly unstable. Anyone remaining inside a building would face suffocation, collapse, darkness, and the difficulty of moving through deepening deposits. The town's earlier evacuation becomes the difference between a buried settlement and a mass grave. The sound must be continuous. Explosions from the vent roll across the island. Pumice rattles against walls and roofs. Thunder forms inside the ash cloud as electrical charges build between colliding particles. The ground vibrates beneath repeated blasts. Visibility falls until familiar landmarks vanish only a short distance away. Breathing becomes painful as fine ash enters the mouth, nose, and lungs. Water stored in open containers turns gritty. Crops disappear under deposits that grow by the hour. At sea, the eruption creates a different form of chaos. Pumice spreads across the surface in floating rafts, clogging shorelines and interfering with boats. Ash reduces visibility and hides the sun, making navigation difficult even for sailors who know the local waters. Waves carry volcanic debris outward. Vessels that escaped earlier may encounter darkness, falling material, and changing winds while trying to reach neighbouring islands. A boat close to Thera could be damaged by pumice. Struck by falling fragments, overturned by waves, or trapped within floating debris. The eruption column rises higher as activity intensifies. Modern estimates vary, but it may have reached tens of kilometres into the atmosphere. At such height, ash enters powerful winds and spreads across much of the eastern Mediterranean. Fine particles later settle far from Thera, leaving traces that can be identified in marine sediments, lake beds, archaeological sites, and geological layers. These distant deposits help researchers map the eruption's reach. Although ash thickness and preservation differ greatly from one region to another, the volcano is drawing magma from a large underground reservoir. As the eruption continues, the chamber beneath the island loses support. Fractures widen. Sections of the volcanic structure begin to fail. Water may enter vents, adding steam-driven explosions to the violence, though scholars still debate exactly how seawater interacted with the eruptive system at each stage. The island that supported fields, houses, roads, and harbours is becoming structurally unstable. The eruption then shifts from a sustained vertical column to more dangerous ground-hugging currents. When the column becomes too dense to remain aloft, parts of it collapse, clouds of hot gas, ash, pumice, and rock surge outward across the surface at extraordinary speed. These pyroclastic density currents do not behave like normal wind or flowing lava. They are turbulent avalanches of heated material capable of crossing land, pouring into valleys, and moving over water for considerable distances. Anything caught in their path is overwhelmed. Vegetation is stripped or buried. Buildings are battered by hot debris. Coastal areas disappear beneath thick deposits. Temperatures within such currents can be lethal even without direct impact, and oxygen becomes scarce inside the ash-filled atmosphere. The exact temperatures and velocities vary between phases, but survival near the active centre would have been nearly impossible once these currents began. Akrotiri lies some distance from the main volcanic vents, yet it is not protected. Successive deposits enter the settlement, filling low spaces and pressing against walls. Pumice falls from above while surging material arrives laterally. Rooms already damaged by earthquakes begin collapsing inward. Roof beams break under load. Upper floors drop into lower chambers. Walls remain standing in some places because surrounding ash supports them as they fail, creating the unusual preservation archaeologists will later uncover. The wider island changes even more dramatically. As magma withdrawal continues, the central part of the volcanic system collapses. The process may occur in stages rather than in one sudden event. Great blocks of land subside along fractures, enlarging the caldera and allowing the sea to enter areas that had been dry or partly enclosed. The collapse displaces enormous volumes of water and debris. Coastlines are torn apart. Harbours vanish. Cliffs form where inhabited land once extended. The modern flooded basin around Santorini is the result of this long volcanic history, but the Bronze Age eruption gives it much of its present form. It does not simply cover the island with ash. It removes sections of the island itself. The geography familiar to Akrotiri's inhabitants is broken open. Routes, fields, anchorages, shrines, and settlements beyond the excavated town may collapse into the caldera or disappear beneath later deposits. This destruction helps explain why so little is known about other communities that may have lived on Thera. The scale of the eruption is difficult to express through simple comparisons. It ranks among the largest explosive eruptions of the Holocene, releasing many tens of cubic kilometers of material when measured in its expanded deposited form. Estimates differ because parts of the eruption lie beneath the sea or have been eroded, and methods of calculating volume have changed. What is certain is that the event is far larger than the eruption that buried Pompeii. Its effects extend across the Aegean and alter landscapes well beyond the immediate vent. Yet even an eruption of this magnitude does not destroy the entire eastern Mediterranean in a single instant. Distance, wind direction, topography, and timing matter. Some regions receive heavy ash, others experience only a thin layer. Some coastlines are exposed to powerful waves. Sheltered areas may suffer less. Ships at sea face different dangers depending on their position. Communities on Crete or other islands may witness darkness, ashfall, strange sunsets, floating pumice, and disrupted trade without being physically erased. The atmosphere above the eruption carries sulfur gases and fine particles that may affect climate temporarily. Large explosive eruptions can reduce incoming sunlight and cool parts of the planet for a limited period. Whether the Thera eruption produced a clearly detectable global climatic event remains debated. Ice cores, tree rings, and other records contain signals from ancient volcanic episodes, but matching a particular signal to Thera has proved difficult. The eruption is vast. Yet the evidence does not support every dramatic claim made about worldwide darkness or years of universal famine. On Thera itself, there is no ambiguity. The island's agricultural system is destroyed. Fresh water is contaminated or buried, pastures vanish, ports are lost, houses collapse, even areas that escape the hottest currents become uninhabitable beneath thick pumice and ash. Survival now depends entirely on having left before the final phases. The people watching from another island, if any escaped that far, would see a shape unlike anything in ordinary experience. A column towers over the horizon by day and glows with internal lightning by night. Ash spreads across the sky. Pumice arrives on distant shores. Waves behave strangely. The island that held their homes is hidden inside a cloud, and when the air finally clears, its outline is no longer the same. Akrotiri has stopped being a living town. Its streets no longer lead anywhere. Its houses are crushed, filled, and sealed. The painted rooms, storage jars, tools, and furniture impressions are entombed beneath the products of the eruption itself. The volcano has destroyed the society that built them, yet the burial is so rapid and so complete that ordinary decay cannot reach much of what remains. Beneath the new volcanic landscape, the Bronze Age world begins its long preservation. The burial of Akrotiri does not happen as a single clean moment. The town disappears through layers. Pumice falls into streets and courtyards. Ash enters through windows and broken roofs. Walls collapse under accumulating weight, and later volcanic currents push hot debris through spaces already partly filled. Each phase adds another covering, and together they create an accidental system of preservation more effective than anything the inhabitants could have designed. At first, the lightest material settles into exposed areas. Fine ash drifts beneath doors, gathers on floors, and fills the spaces between pottery vessels. Pumice collects on rooftops and upper stories, where its weight presses down upon wooden beams weakened by earlier earthquakes. Some roofs fail gradually, others collapse suddenly, dropping furniture, plaster, and masonry into the rooms below. In certain buildings, walls remain standing because the volcanic material rises around them almost as quickly as they break. The deposit becomes both destroyer and support. This is why Akrotiri survives differently from an ordinary abandoned settlement. A deserted house normally begins to decay from the top downward. Rain enters through the roof, timber rots, walls lean and fall. Later inhabitants remove stone, reuse beams, dig through floors, and carry away useful objects. Wind scatters lighter material, plants open cracks, and generations of construction erase the original arrangement. At Akrotiri, volcanic burial interrupts this slow process. The town is removed from weather, rebuilding, a most human interference before ordinary decay can dismantle it. The preservation is not perfect. Many upper stories collapse, wooden objects burn, rot, or vanish. Walls shift under pressure. Frescoes break into thousands of fragments. Heavy volcanic deposits distort rooms, and later earthquakes disturb already damaged structures. Yet enough survives to preserve relationships between objects. A jar remains beside the wall where it was stored. Loom weights lie in patterns that suggest the position of a loom. Cooking equipment stays near hearths. Fallen plaster retains the painted surface that once faced into a room. Archaeology depends not only on what survives, but on where it survives, and Akrotiri preserves location with unusual precision. Wood presents one of the site's strangest forms of survival. Timber beams, shelves, beds, tables, stools, and boxes eventually decay inside compacted volcanic material. Their substance disappears, but the spaces they occupied remain as cavities. Excavators can fill these hollows with plaster or other material, producing casts of objects that no longer exist. What emerges is not the original furniture, but its exact absence made visible. The method reveals curved bed frames, table legs, storage chests, and architectural timbers otherwise lost to time. Organic materials leave subtler traces. Seeds and grains become carbonized, mineralized, or protected within sealed containers. Olive pits, fig remains, lentils, barley, and wheat survive in forms that can be identified under laboratory examination. Fish bones and animal remains provide evidence of diet. Impressions of baskets, ropes, mats, and textiles may remain where fibers pressed into ash or mud before decaying. A woven object can disappear completely while leaving enough texture to reveal how it was made. The large storage jars become small sealed archives. Some contain residues that indicate oil, wine, grain, pulses, or other products. Others may have been empty at the time of burial. Their contents help reconstruct not just diet, but season. Harvested crops, stored food, and plant maturity can indicate what time of year the eruption occurred. although the clues do not all point with complete certainty to a single narrow date. Scholars have proposed spring or early summer based on insect remains, plant cycles, and stored produce, but the evidence remains incomplete and open to refinement. Frescoes survive through a combination of preparation, collapse, and burial. Painters had applied pigments to layers of plaster, creating surfaces strong enough to endure ordinary use but not the force of an eruption. When walls fail, painted sections fall inward, some land face upward and suffer damage. Others fall painted side down, protecting colour beneath the plaster mass. Ash covers the fragments before sun, rain, and human contact can fade them, centuries later. Archaeologists recover pieces that must be cleaned, matched, and reassembled like enormous broken puzzles. The colours retain a freshness that changes modern understanding of the Bronze Age. Ancient ruins often appear as bare stone, encouraging the false impression that the past was grey and undecorated. Akrotiri reveals interiors filled with red, blue, yellow, white, and black. Figures move across walls. Plants rise from painted landscapes. Ships cross imaginary seas. The volcano does not preserve every shade exactly as it appeared, and chemical changes alter some pigments. But the surviving surfaces still carry the visual ambition of the town. Volcanic material also protects the architecture from fire more effectively than might be expected. Parts of the eruption are hot, but Akrotiri is not preserved as a city uniformly burned to ash. Some deposits arrive cool enough, or lose heat quickly enough, that plaster, pottery, food remains, and structural details survive. The exact temperatures vary between phases and locations. No single description applies to the entire town. In some spaces, heat alters materials, in others. Burial rather than burning is the dominant process. As the deposits deepen, the shape of the settlement disappears from the surface. Streets become shallow depressions, then vanish. Rooflines are covered. The highest surviving walls are sealed. Wind redistributes loose ash across the island, smoothing the broken town beneath a pale volcanic landscape. From a distance, there may be little to suggest that multi-story buildings lie below. Akrotiri becomes not a visible ruin, but a hidden layer inside Thera. Rain eventually falls upon the new deposits. Water cuts channels through loose pumice and ash, but it also compacts parts of the surface. Over time, volcanic material hardens. Later eruptions add new layers elsewhere on the island. Erosion exposes some cliffs while burying other areas deeper. Human communities eventually return to Santorini, but the Bronze Age town remains concealed beneath deposits too thick and difficult to remove casually. The eruption therefore creates a strange reversal. The most fragile parts of Akrotiri survive because the strongest parts fail around them. Roof collapse brings frescoes to the floor, where they are protected. Furniture vanishes, but hardened ash preserves its shape. Food becomes inedible, but sealed jars protect its remains. Streets are erased from sight, yet burial preserves their paths. Destruction strips the town of life, while protecting evidence of how that life was organized. This protection has limits that matter. Akrotiri is only partly excavated. Much of the settlement still lies beneath volcanic material, and some areas may never be accessible because of modern construction, instability, or conservation concerns. The excavated buildings may represent a wealthier district rather than the entire social range of the town. Ordinary houses, harbour installations, fields, cemeteries, and poorer neighbourhoods may remain undiscovered. What survives in the visible site is extraordinary, but it is not necessarily complete. Even within excavated rooms, interpretation depends on careful restraint. A vessel found near a wall may have stood there before the eruption, or may have shifted during collapse. A fresco fragment can be restored incorrectly. A cavity interpreted as furniture may have another explanation. Volcanic burial preserves context, but it also creates a complicated sequence of movement, pressure, and destruction. Archaeologists must distinguish the town as it was lived in from the town as it fell. The layers covering Akrotiri become a geological clock as well as an archaeological one. Their order records the changing behaviour of the eruption early pumice falls, heavier ash, collapsing columns, and later surges. Inside the town, those same layers record how buildings respond. The history of the volcano and the history of the settlement are physically joined, room by room and deposit by deposit. When the eruption ends, no one returns to clear the streets. There is no rebuilding above the old foundations, no attempt to rescue the jars or repaint the walls. The island is too altered, the deposits too deep, and the settlement too thoroughly buried. Akrotiri enters a silence that lasts for millennia. Above it, the Aegean world continues. Ships sail different routes, palaces rise and decline, languages change, empires appear and vanish. The people of Thera, wherever they have gone, become impossible to identify among the populations of the wider region. Their town remains beneath the pumice, sealed with its rooms, tools, colours, and unfinished repairs. The volcano has not preserved a perfect instant. It has preserved a process earthquake damage, human response, abandonment, eruption, collapse, and burial. That sequence makes Akrotiri more than a collection of beautiful artifacts. It is a trapped landscape of decisions and consequences, protected by the same event that ended it. Beyond the buried streets, however, the eruption continues moving outward. The island is sealed, but the sea carries the disaster toward distant shores. The destruction does not remain confined to Thera, as the eruption reshapes the island, collapses parts of the volcanic structure, and drives enormous volumes of material into the sea. The surrounding water begins to carry the catastrophe outward. Waves spread through the Aegean, crossing distances that ash and pumice have already begun to darken. Along distant coasts, people who cannot see the volcano may first encounter it through the behavior of the sea. A tsunami is not an ordinary storm wave. Wind-driven waves disturb mainly the upper surface, but a tsunami moves a deep column of water from the seafloor upward. In open water, its height may remain modest, while its wavelength stretches across many kilometers. A ship far from shore may pass over it without recognizing the danger. As the wave enters shallower coastal water, however, it slows, compresses, and rises. Bays, river mouths, low coastal plains, and narrow harbours can amplify its force. The shape of each shoreline determines how destruction is distributed, which is why two communities separated by only a short distance may experience very different outcomes. The exact mechanism that generated the Thera tsunamis remains debated. Caldera collapse is an obvious possibility, but it may not have occurred as one single plunge capable of creating one enormous wave. The entry of pyroclastic flows into the sea could have displaced water repeatedly. Underwater explosions, landslides, and the collapse of coastal sectors may also have contributed. The eruption probably produced several waves during different phases rather than one perfectly defined event. No single explanation fully accounts for every deposit identified around the Aegean. Near Thera, the first waves could have been devastating. Temporary camps along the coast, boats waiting offshore, and inhabitants who had fled Akrotiri without leaving the island would all be exposed. The sea may initially withdraw from some shores as water is drawn into a passing wave trough. Fish and stranded vessels could appear on newly exposed seabed, tempting or confusing anyone unfamiliar with the warning. The returning water would arrive rapidly, carrying pumice, timber, shattered boats. Building debris and volcanic sediment. If evacuees had assembled near a harbour, the very place chosen for escape could become a trap. Boats tied close to shore might be thrown inland or dragged back out. Vessels already under sail could be safer in deep water, but falling ash, poor visibility, and floating pumice would still make survival uncertain. The missing population of Akrotiri may have escaped the buried town only to face hazards along the coast or at sea. This possibility is compelling, but it remains an inference. No fleet of refugee vessels has been identified beneath the Aegean, and no mass grave securely connected to Akrotiri's inhabitants has been found. The waves move south toward Crete, roughly 100 kilometers away. Northern Crete supports important Minoan ports, towns, farms, and palace-linked communities. These coastal centres depend on ships, warehouses, fishing grounds, and access to trade routes. A powerful tsunami entering their bays could damage docks, destroy vessels, flood low buildings, contaminate wells, and cover fields with salt and debris. Even a community whose houses survive may lose the infrastructure connecting it to the wider world. Geological and archaeological investigations have found deposits on parts of northern Crete that are consistent with tsunami flooding around the time of the eruption. Marine organisms, sand, gravel, pumice, and disturbed sediments appear in places where ordinary waves are unlikely to have placed them. At Palaikastro in eastern Crete, researchers have examined chaotic coastal deposits containing volcanic material and marine remains. Similar evidence has been reported from other locations. Though not every proposed tsunami layer is accepted, dating coastal deposits precisely is difficult, and storms, earthquakes, human disturbance, and later erosion can imitate or erase parts of the record. The absence of a deposit does not prove that no wave arrived. Tsunami sediments are fragile. Later waves can remove them. Farming can mix them into soil. Construction can destroy them. Sea levels change. Coastlines move, and sections of Bronze Age shore now lie underwater. Conversely, the presence of sand or broken shells alone does not prove a tsunami. Researchers must combine sediment structure, marine species, volcanic chemistry, elevation, archaeological context, and dating before drawing conclusions. Computer models help test possible scenarios, but their results depend on assumptions about the prehistoric island. Researchers must estimate the shape of Thera before collapse, the volume and speed of material entering the sea, the sequence of eruptive phases, and ancient water depths. Small changes in these inputs can produce different wave heights and arrival patterns. Some models suggest severe effects on nearby islands and parts of northern Crete. Others indicate that earlier claims of uniformly gigantic waves across the entire eastern Mediterranean were exaggerated. This distinction matters because the Thera tsunami is sometimes presented as a wall of water that instantly destroys Minoan civilization. The evidence does not support such a simple story. Crete is large, mountainous, and home to many settlements far above the coast. A tsunami could devastate harbours without erasing inland populations or palace centres. Knossos, located away from the northern shoreline, would not be swept away by the same waves striking exposed coastal towns. Minoan society continues after the eruption, and some sites show rebuilding rather than immediate abandonment. Yet survival does not mean the event is minor. A maritime civilization can be weakened by concentrated coastal damage. Ships require years of timber, labour, and experience to replace. Harbours organise trade, taxation, fishing, communication, and military movement. Destroying a fleet or warehouse does more than remove objects. It breaks relationships between communities. A palace may remain standing while its supply routes collapse. Merchants may survive but lose cargo, vessels, crews, and credit. Fishing families may return to find boats shattered and coastal soils coated with salt. Ashfall compounds these effects. Even where the deposit is thin, ash can foul water, damage crops, irritate eyes and lungs, and create uncertainty about future harvests. Floating pumice can crowd harbours for months or longer, affecting navigation and leaving pale bands along shorelines. Sunlight filtered through volcanic haze may alter weather temporarily, though the regional agricultural consequences remain difficult to measure. Communities already dealing with earthquake damage or political tension would experience the disaster differently from stable, well-provisioned centres. The waves also travel north and east. Evidence from the coastal settlement of Çeşme-Bağlararası in western Anatolia has provided one of the most striking glimpses of the disaster beyond Thera. Archaeologists uncovered layers interpreted as repeated tsunami inundations associated with the eruption. Collapsed structures, disturbed sediments, marine material, and volcanic ash point to a coastal community struck by more than one surge. A human skeleton and the remains of a dog were found within the destruction, a rare discovery in a catastrophe otherwise famous for its missing victims. This person cannot be identified as an inhabitant of Akrotiri. The distance is too great, and no evidence links the individual directly to Thera. Yet the burial shows that the eruption's human consequences extend beyond the island, and that at least some victims may lie in coastal deposits rather than volcanic ruins. It also reveals how misleading the absence of bodies at Akrotiri can be. The disaster occupies a vast maritime landscape, much of which remains underwater or beneath later settlements. At Çeşme, evidence suggests that people may have attempted rescue or recovery between waves. Disturbed debris and possible digging activity raise the possibility that survivors searched collapsed areas before another inundation arrived. The interpretation remains under study, but it captures the prolonged character of tsunami danger. The first wave is not always the largest. Water can return repeatedly over hours, and survivors who enter flooded ruins too soon may be caught by later surges. Across the Aegean, News of the event travels with refugees, sailors, and floating debris. Communities see ash clouds on the horizon or find pumice covering beaches. Ships fail to arrive. Familiar trading partners vanish. Stories spread faster than accurate understanding. An island has exploded, the sea has entered settlements, and daylight has changed. Such experiences can leave cultural memories, but linking later myths directly to Thera is hazardous. Oral traditions transform over centuries, and similar flood or fire stories emerge from many natural disasters. The physical record is more restrained but no less powerful. Marine sediment inside ruined buildings, volcanic particles far from their source, displaced stones, broken harbour installations, and drowned coastlines reveal a catastrophe transmitted through water. The tsunami does not create one uniform ring of destruction. It follows the complicated geography of the Aegean, striking some shores violently, passing others with less force, and leaving traces that survive only by chance. When the waves finally diminish, the sea does not return to its earlier role immediately. Coastlines have changed. Pumice floats across shipping routes. Harbours hold wreckage. Survivors search flooded ground, bury the dead where they can, repair boats, and wait for absent vessels. Thera remains concealed beneath ash, its central landscape broken open and flooded. Around it, the societies of the Aegean continue, but they continue within a network that has lost one of its most active ports. The disaster has now crossed from geology into history. It has struck fields, households, ships, and trade routes far beyond the volcano. The question is no longer whether Thera affected the wider Bronze Age world, but how deeply those effects penetrated its most powerful civilization. On Crete, the palaces still stand, ceremonies continue, and Minoan authority survives. Beneath that continuity, however, the foundations of maritime wealth may already be under strain. Crete survives the eruption, that fact is essential, because the destruction of Thera has often been turned into a convenient explanation for everything that happens afterward. The image is compelling. A prosperous island civilization dominates the Aegean. A volcano explodes. Tsunamis strike its ports, and the Minoan world collapses. It is a story with the clean shape of tragedy. Archaeology offers something more complicated. Minoan society does not vanish when Thera erupts. Palaces remain active. Pottery continues to be produced. Religious practices endure. Trade resumes. Some damaged coastal settlements are rebuilt. The eruption is a severe shock, but it is not a single blow that immediately ends civilization on Crete. The difficulty lies in measuring damage across a large and varied island. Northern Crete faces Thera directly, but its coastline contains exposed bays, sheltered coves, high ground, low plains, and ports of different sizes. A tsunami can destroy one harbour while leaving another partly functional. Ashfall depends on wind direction, and may be thick in some areas and barely visible in others. Inland palace centres experience the disaster through disrupted supplies, refugees, damaged roads, or lost ships rather than direct burial. There is no single Minoan experience of the eruption. Coastal communities probably suffer first. Warehouses near the shore are vulnerable to flooding. Ships anchored in harbours can be smashed against stone quays or thrown inland. Fishing boats, nets, ropes, timber, and stored cargo disappear in a few violent minutes. Salt water enters wells and fields. Mud, marine debris, pumice, and broken masonry fill working areas. Survivors face an immediate problem of food and fresh water even when their houses remain standing. The loss of ships may be more damaging than the destruction of buildings. A large Bronze Age vessel represents timber gathered from distant forests, skilled carpentry, woven sails, rope, bronze fittings, and a crew trained through years of experience. Ships cannot be replaced quickly. If several ports lose vessels at the same time, trade across the Aegean slows sharply. Copper, tin, ivory, pigments, grain, oil, wine, pottery, and luxury goods no longer move with the same reliability. Merchants lose cargoes and partners. Palace authorities lose taxes, tribute, and information. Minoan power depends heavily on maritime connection. Crete is agriculturally productive, but its elite culture is supported by exchange extending far beyond the island. Imported raw materials become prestige objects in palace workshops. Foreign goods reinforce status. Diplomatic relationships are maintained through gifts and movement. When sea routes fail, the problem is not only economic. Political authority becomes harder to display and harder to enforce. Ash may create another layer of strain. Fine volcanic material can damage young plants, contaminate water, and irritate livestock. Thick deposits can smother fields, but even thin ash can complicate harvest and food preparation. Whether Crete experiences widespread crop failure remains uncertain. The known ash deposits do not support the idea that the entire island was buried deeply enough to destroy agriculture everywhere. Yet local losses, combined with disrupted shipping and damaged storage, could still create shortages. A society with large reserves may endure one poor season. Repeated shocks are more dangerous. Climate effects are harder to trace. Sulfur released into the atmosphere may have reduced sunlight and altered weather for a limited period, as major eruptions often do. Tree rings and ice cores preserve signs of ancient volcanic cooling, but matching those signals precisely to Thera remains controversial. Some proposed dates do not align neatly with the archaeological chronology. The evidence remains incomplete, and claims of years of universal darkness go far beyond what can be demonstrated. Even so, modest cooling or unusual rainfall could intensify difficulties already caused by coastal destruction. The palace centres respond with the tools available to complex societies: storage, redistribution, labour organisation, religious authority, and control of surviving trade routes. Grain can be moved from less affected regions. Workers can rebuild damaged facilities. Ships can be commissioned. Ceremonies can reassure communities that order remains intact. Palace institutions may even strengthen temporarily if people become more dependent on centralized resources during recovery. This resilience helps explain why Minoan culture continues to flourish after the eruption. Artistic production remains sophisticated. Administrative systems still function. Buildings are repaired or reconstructed. New political arrangements may emerge, but there is no clear island-wide abandonment. The most dramatic collapse comes later, when many Cretan centres are destroyed or transformed and mainland Greek influence grows stronger. The gap between the eruption and these later disruptions is too large and too historically complex to treat them as one event. Depending on the chronology used, decades may separate Thera's eruption from the final decline of the major Minoan palace system. This matters. A disaster can weaken a society without destroying it immediately, but the longer the interval, the more room there is for other causes: earthquakes, internal competition, changing trade routes, warfare, rebellion, and the rising power of Mycenaean centres on the Greek mainland all become part of the picture. No single explanation fully accounts for the transition. The Mycenaeans are increasingly connected to Crete during this period. Mainland elites adopt and adapt Minoan artistic styles, religious symbols, administrative practices, and luxury goods. They are not outsiders encountering an unknown civilization. They already participate in the same Aegean networks. If Cretan maritime strength is reduced after the eruption, mainland powers may gain opportunities to expand influence. This is plausible, but it does not require a simple invasion immediately following the catastrophe. Political weakness may emerge gradually. A palace that loses ships and foreign contacts may struggle to maintain alliances. Local elites who control surviving resources may become more independent. Rival centres may compete for access to ports and trade. Communities required to provide labour or goods for reconstruction may resist increasing demands. Religious authority may be questioned if ceremonies fail to prevent repeated disasters. These processes leave fewer dramatic archaeological traces than a tsunami, but over time they can be more decisive. Earthquakes continue to affect the region as well. The southern Aegean remains tectonically active, and buildings rebuilt after one disaster may be damaged by another. Destruction layers at Cretan sites do not all belong to the same moment or cause. Fire, seismic collapse, human attack, and abandonment can produce similar ruins. Earlier scholars often group them into one great catastrophe. More careful dating reveals a patchwork of events. The eruption may therefore be understood as a force multiplier. It does not create every later problem, but it makes existing vulnerabilities harder to manage. It damages parts of the maritime system, forces costly rebuilding, interrupts communication, and perhaps displaces populations. It may reduce the margin of safety that allows palace economies to absorb drought, conflict, or political rivalry. A society can appear powerful while becoming less flexible beneath the surface. This interpretation is less dramatic than the idea of a single volcanic apocalypse, but it is more consistent with the evidence. Civilizations rarely collapse for only one reason. Their institutions can survive terrible disasters and then fail under a combination of pressures that no one event would have caused alone. Crete demonstrates both resilience and fragility. Its palaces continue, but the world around them has changed. Thera is gone as a functioning centre. Its merchants no longer arrive. Its ships no longer connect northern and southern routes. Refugees may enter other communities, bringing skills and memories but also increasing demand for food and space. Coastal settlements rebuild in altered landscapes. The Aegean network closes around the absence of an island that once helped hold it together. For generations, Minoan life continues beneath painted walls and within palace courts. Ceremonies are performed, records are kept, and ships again cross the sea. Yet the balance of power is shifting. Mainland rulers grow wealthier. Cretan centres become more vulnerable to competition and control from abroad. The eruption does not end the Minoan world, but it may help open the conditions in which that world can eventually be transformed. The true consequence of Thera is therefore not a single date of destruction. It is a long disturbance moving through trade, authority, ecology, and memory. Akrotiri is buried in hours, but the effects of its loss unfold across decades. And while historians debate how much of Crete's later decline begins with the volcano, one mystery remains closer and more personal: the city beneath the ash is empty, and the people who fled it have left no clear destination behind. The absence of bodies at Akrotiri is not a minor detail. It is the feature that changes the entire emotional character of the site. In most ancient disasters, human remains anchor the story to a final moment. They show where people ran, what they carried, how buildings failed, and whether death came through heat, impact, suffocation, drowning, or collapse. At Akrotiri, the houses are full of possessions but almost empty of people. The streets preserve damage and abandonment. Yet they do not preserve a population caught in place. The town appears to have been warned, evacuated, and then sealed beneath volcanic material after its inhabitants had already gone. This is encouraging only at first glance. Escaping the town does not necessarily mean escaping the eruption. Akrotiri is one settlement on an island undergoing earthquakes, ashfall, coastal destruction, and eventual caldera collapse. The inhabitants may have left their houses and moved toward open ground, temporary camps, or harbours. Some may have crossed the sea before the worst phase began. Others may have remained elsewhere on Thera, beyond the excavated area, believing the distance from unstable buildings was enough to protect them. The archaeological silence inside the town therefore reveals successful departure, but not final survival. The most hopeful possibility is that evacuation begins early enough for much of the population to reach other islands. Thera lies within a familiar maritime world. Sailors know routes toward Crete, Anafi, Ios, Amorgos, Melos, and other Cycladic communities. Akrotiri's merchants have trading partners, relatives, and social contacts across the Aegean. Refugees arriving with boats, valuable goods, tools, and specialized skills may be absorbed into existing settlements. They would not necessarily remain identifiable as a separate people for long. Their pottery, language, clothing, and religious customs are closely related to those of neighboring communities. Within a generation, descendants of Thera could become archaeologically invisible. There is no known inscription announcing the arrival of Akrotiri's survivors. Linear A remains undeciphered, and Bronze Age administrative records are fragmentary, even at better documented sites. Refugees rarely leave monuments describing themselves. They appear indirectly through sudden changes in population, architecture, craft production, or artistic styles. Researchers have occasionally searched for signs of Theran migrants in Crete and the Cyclades, but none provides a universally accepted answer. Similarities in objects may reflect trade rather than migration, while differences may result from local development rather than incoming refugees. Ships complicate the question further. The town's painted walls celebrate vessels, but the real fleet available during the crisis is unknown. Some ships may have been away when the earthquakes began. Others may have returned to help move residents. Small craft could carry families to nearby islands, while larger vessels might transport dozens of people and supplies. Yet every boat has a limit. Water, food, weather, crew capacity, and time determine how many journeys can be made. An organised evacuation is possible only if warning lasts long enough and maritime conditions remain manageable. The final stages of volcanic unrest may have turned those journeys into desperate races. Ash reduces visibility and obscures landmarks. Floating pumice slows vessels and clogs steering equipment. Falling fragments damage decks and sails. Lightning flashes inside the eruption cloud while winds shift unpredictably around the rising column. A boat that leaves too late may vanish at sea without leaving remains that archaeologists can find. Wood decays, cargo scatters, and deep water conceals wrecks beneath later sediment. Tsunamis create an even darker possibility. Evacuees often gather along coasts because ships represent escape, but coastal concentration increases exposure to sudden waves. If hundreds of people wait near a harbour with food and possessions, a tsunami can erase the entire group while leaving the inland town free of bodies. Human remains swept into the sea may never return to shore. Boats can be carried inland, broken apart, or dragged into deeper water. The eruption's missing victims may therefore lie beneath submerged coastlines that no longer resemble the Bronze Age landscape. The prehistoric shoreline is poorly understood because the eruption radically changes the island. Areas used as harbours may have collapsed into the caldera or been buried beneath thick deposits. Settlements other than Akrotiri may have existed close to the volcanic centre and disappeared entirely. Fields, shrines, roads, and temporary camps could now lie under the sea. The modern excavation offers an extraordinary view of one district, but it represents only a fraction of the human landscape present before the eruption. The lack of a known cemetery adds another gap. Archaeologists have not securely identified the main burial grounds used by Akrotiri's inhabitants. This may reflect customs that leave little trace, burial locations outside the excavated zone, erosion, or destruction during the eruption. Without graves from the generations before the catastrophe, it is harder to study population size, ancestry, disease, diet, mobility, and family relationships. The town preserves rooms and paintings with astonishing detail while withholding the bodies that would reveal the biology of its people. This imbalance has encouraged speculation. Popular accounts sometimes imagine an entire population rescued by a perfectly timed fleet. Others suggest that the inhabitants became the source of legends about Atlantis or founded new communities elsewhere. Such stories are appealing because they provide a clean ending, but they go beyond the evidence. There is no proof that Akrotiri is Atlantis, no surviving list of evacuees, and no identified colony that can be securely traced back to Thera. The most responsible conclusion remains less satisfying. Many people probably left the town, but their ultimate fate is unknown. Even the claim that no bodies were found requires precision. Human remains are extremely rare at Akrotiri, but excavation covers only part of the ancient settlement. Future work could uncover victims trapped in unexcavated buildings, open spaces, or peripheral districts. A single skeleton would not overturn the evidence for large-scale evacuation, but it would show that departure was incomplete. Archaeology often changes through discoveries that reveal exceptions to previously clear patterns. The residents may also have departed in stages. Wealthy households with ships and foreign contacts could leave first, carrying portable valuables. Workers might remain to clear debris, guard property, gather food, or prepare additional vessels. Farmers living outside the central town may receive warnings later. Sailors away from Thera may return after the eruption to find the island unrecognizable. There may never have been one moment when the entire population acted together. Objects left behind preserve these unequal choices. Heavy jars remain because they cannot be carried. Valuable metals are comparatively scarce because they can. Repair tools suggest people stay long enough to work after the earthquakes. Beds placed outside indicate temporary occupation. Rooms stripped of certain possessions imply preparation rather than sudden flight. Yet no object reveals the final command to leave, the route chosen, or the moment a family decides not to return. For those who reach another island, survival brings its own losses. They arrive without houses, fields, stored harvests, or the social structures that once defined them. Elite status in Akrotiri may mean little in a foreign settlement. Craftspeople can trade skill for protection, but farmers need land, sailors need vessels, and families need acceptance. Refugees may preserve stories of painted houses and a mountain that broke open. But memories change as children grow up in places they did not choose. Akrotiri's people vanish not because they leave no evidence of life, but because they leave too much evidence of everything except their destination. Their rooms are intimate enough to create the illusion that they have only stepped outside. Cups wait near jars, tools remain in workshops, painted figures continue their ceremonies beneath the ash. The city seems ready to receive its residents again. Even though generations pass, kingdoms rise and fall, and the language once spoken in its streets disappears. This is the central human mystery of the eruption. The volcano preserves the stage after the actors have gone. It gives modern archaeology houses without names, possessions without owners, and an evacuation without an ending. Somewhere beyond the buried walls, the people of Akrotiri either survived, died, or scattered into communities that no longer remembered where their ancestors had come from. The evidence cannot yet choose between these possibilities. What it can show is that they recognized danger, acted before the final burial, and left behind one of the most complete ancient worlds ever found precisely because they were no longer there to reclaim it. For more than 3,000 years, Akrotiri remains hidden beneath the volcanic surface of Thera. The town does not survive as a recognizable ruin standing above the ground. Its streets are buried too deeply, its walls sealed inside pumice, and its coastline altered beyond recognition. Later inhabitants return to the island and build new settlements without fully understanding what lies below them. Fields are cultivated over the remains of Bronze Age houses. Paths cross deposits containing painted walls and storage rooms. The lost city becomes part of the landscape, present everywhere beneath the surface but absent from memory. The volcanic layers are difficult to ignore. Pale pumice appears in cliffs, quarries, and cuttings across the island. Local people use volcanic material for construction and agriculture, sometimes exposing fragments of pottery or masonry. Ancient objects may have been noticed long before formal archaeology began, but isolated finds do not immediately reveal the scale of the buried settlement. A broken vessel can belong to a grave, a farmhouse, a shrine, or debris carried from elsewhere. Only careful excavation can show that these fragments remain inside an entire preserved town. Interest in Thera grows during the 19th century, when geology and archaeology are becoming organized scientific disciplines. European travelers, naturalists, engineers, and scholars visit the island to examine its dramatic cliffs and volcanic history. The exposed layers offer a visible sequence of eruptions extending far into the past. Embedded within those layers are traces of human occupation, demonstrating that people lived on Thera before the Great Bronze Age catastrophe. One of the earliest important investigations occurs during quarrying associated with construction projects in the eastern Mediterranean. Pumice from Santorini is valuable as a building material, and extraction exposes prehistoric walls, pottery, and other remains. The French geologist Ferdinand Fouquet examines discoveries on the island during the 1860s and recognizes that substantial structures lie beneath the eruption deposits. His observations establish that a developed prehistoric settlement existed on Thera before classical Greek history. Yet the buried town does not immediately become a major excavation. Archaeology in the 19th century is still drawn toward monumental temples, royal tombs, inscriptions, and objects associated with famous civilizations described in ancient texts. A prehistoric island settlement without readable documents or known kings seems less urgent than sites connected to Homer, Egypt, or the great cities of Mesopotamia. The scale of Akrotiri's preservation is not yet understood, and much of the site remains inaccessible beneath meters of hardened volcanic material. The situation changes as research across the Aegean reveals the depth and complexity of Bronze Age civilization. Excavations on Crete uncover the palace at Knossos and other centres associated with the culture later called Minoan. Discoveries on the Greek mainland reveal wealthy Mycenaean societies. Cycladic islands produce distinctive figurines, pottery, settlements, and burial evidence. The prehistoric Aegean is no longer seen as an empty prelude to classical Greece. It becomes a world of maritime trade, complex architecture, artistic innovation, and political competition. Within this changing picture, Thera takes on new importance. The close artistic and commercial relationships between the island and Crete raise a major historical question. Could the eruption of Thera have contributed to the decline of Minoan civilization? The idea attracts the Greek archaeologist Spiridon Marinatos, who argues that a volcanic catastrophe and associated tsunamis may have damaged Cretan centres. His theory is ambitious and, in its strongest form, too simple. But it directs attention toward the buried settlement as a place where the relationship between geology and history might be studied directly. Systematic excavation begins in 1967 near the modern village of Akrotiri. The site takes its modern archaeological name from that village because the Bronze Age name of the town is unknown. Marinatos chooses the area partly because earlier discoveries and surface evidence suggest substantial remains below. Almost immediately, excavation confirms that this is not a small cluster of houses. Walls rise from the pumice, streets emerge, pottery appears in storerooms. Multi-story buildings begin to take shape beneath the excavation trenches. The work is unusually difficult. Archaeologists are not simply brushing soil from stone foundations. They must remove enormous quantities of volcanic material while protecting structures weakened by ancient earthquakes, collapse, and pressure. Walls that survived for millennia within compacted ash can become unstable once exposed to air and relieved of surrounding support. Wooden beams have vanished, leaving gaps inside masonry. Upper floors hang above filled rooms. Every layer removed may reveal a fresco fragment or cause fragile plaster to shift. Excavation therefore proceeds alongside engineering and conservation. Supports are installed beneath walls and floors. Deposits are recorded carefully so that the sequence of earthquake damage, human activity, eruption, and collapse can be reconstructed. Pottery is mapped before removal. Fresco fragments are gathered according to their location, orientation, and depth. Even apparently featureless ash matters because changes in texture and composition identify separate eruptive phases. The discovery of frescoes transforms the importance of the site. Fragments of painted plaster emerge from rooms in colours rarely associated with prehistoric Europe. As conservators begin assembling them, entire scenes return saffron gatherers among crocuses, fishermen carrying their catch, elegant women in ceremonial dress, blue monkeys, antelopes, ships, towns, rivers, rocks, and dolphins. These images reveal a visual world connected to Crete but not identical to it. They make Akrotiri central to understanding Aegean art, religion, clothing, seafaring, and the representation of nature. The excavation also changes assumptions about Cycladic society. Akrotiri contains planned streets, drainage systems, large buildings, extensive storage, specialized workshops, and imported goods. The settlement is not a remote recipient of Minoan influence. It is an active participant in regional exchange, with its own local traditions and considerable wealth. The volcanic island, once regarded mainly as the possible cause of destruction, becomes evidence for a sophisticated society in its own right. Marinatos dies at the site in 1974 after an accident during excavation, and is buried near the ruins. Work continues under later directors, most notably Christos Doumas, with increasing emphasis on conservation, publication, environmental evidence, and careful interpretation. Excavation moves slowly because exposing more buildings creates a permanent responsibility to protect them. Akrotiri is not an unlimited source of spectacular objects. It is a fragile architectural system that can be damaged by the very act of revealing it. A large protective structure is eventually built over the excavated area to shield walls and frescoes from sun, rain, wind, and rapid temperature changes. The shelter allows visitors to walk along raised paths above ancient streets, while archaeological work continues below. Yet protection brings its own challenges. Modern structures must span large areas without crushing buried remains. Drainage, ventilation, humidity, and seismic safety require constant attention. A serious roof collapse in 2005 leads to the site's closure and extensive redesign before reopening years later, a reminder that preservation is never complete. Most of the Bronze Age settlement remains unexcavated. Archaeologists estimate that the visible buildings represent only a portion of the town, and each new trench could contain houses, workshops, public spaces, harbour facilities, or human remains capable of changing the story. But excavation is deliberately limited. Removing volcanic material destroys the sealed environment that preserved what lies beneath. Once exposed, plaster cracks, pigments fade, and masonry requires permanent maintenance. Sometimes the safest way to preserve Akrotiri is to leave it buried. Modern techniques allow researchers to learn more without opening every room. Soil samples reveal plant remains and microscopic traces. Chemical analysis identifies pigments, pottery origins, and food residues. Digital recording captures architecture in 3 dimensions. Geological surveys reconstruct eruption deposits and ancient coastlines. Microscopic study of insects, seeds, and ash helps estimate the season and sequence of the catastrophe. Each method extracts information from material that earlier excavators might have overlooked. The returning city is therefore not uncovered all at once. It emerges gradually, and every discovery introduces another uncertainty. A building thought to be domestic may prove ceremonial. A painted landscape may represent a real voyage or a symbolic one. A storage room may belong to a household, merchant organization, or public authority. The lack of readable text means interpretation must remain tied to objects, architecture, and comparison with other Aegean sites. Akrotiri comes back into history without revealing its ancient name, its rulers, or the fate of its population. Yet the excavation restores something equally important: the complexity of a community once reduced to a volcanic footnote. Beneath the pumice is not merely evidence of catastrophe, but evidence of generations who built, traded, painted, repaired, stored, worshipped, and sailed. As the city returns to light, it becomes clear that the eruption is not the only mystery preserved within it. Even the date of the disaster itself remains unsettled, divided between scientific measurements and the chronologies historians have built around the wider Bronze Age world. Dating the eruption should seem straightforward. A volcano leaves ash. Ash settles across landscapes. Organic material trapped beneath or within it can be measured. Pottery found above and below can be compared with objects from other regions. Historical records may describe unusual skies, failed harvests, or political disruption. In principle, these different forms of evidence should converge upon a single year, at Thera. They have instead created one of the most persistent chronological disputes in Mediterranean archaeology. The disagreement is not over whether the eruption occurred during the Bronze Age. It concerns a difference of several decades, a gap large enough to alter the sequence of trade, diplomacy, palace history, and political change across the eastern Mediterranean. Scientific dating generally places the eruption in the later 17th century BCE, often somewhere around the 1620s or early 1600s BCE. Traditional archaeological chronology has frequently favoured a date closer to the middle of the 16th century BCE, around 1500 BCE or slightly earlier. The exact ranges have shifted as methods improve, but the tension remains. Radiocarbon dating stands at the centre of the scientific argument. Living organisms absorb radioactive carbon while alive. After death, that isotope decays at a predictable rate, allowing laboratories to estimate when the organism stopped exchanging carbon with the atmosphere. Seeds, branches, wood, and other organic remains associated with the eruption can therefore provide an approximate age. Samples from Akrotiri and other Aegean contexts repeatedly tend to support a date earlier than the traditional historical chronology. Radiocarbon measurement, however, does not produce a simple calendar year. Results must be calibrated because the amount of radioactive carbon in the atmosphere has varied over time. Calibration curves are built from tree rings and other independently dated records. In some periods, these curves contain plateaus or irregular sections, where one radiocarbon measurement can correspond to a relatively broad span of calendar years. The 17th and 16th centuries BCE fall within a difficult part of the curve, limiting the precision researchers would prefer. The most famous sample comes from an olive tree buried in volcanic material on Santorini. A branch found within the eruption deposit was dated through several sections, producing results that appeared to place the eruption in the late 17th century BCE. Because the branch was physically entombed by the eruption, it seemed to offer a direct clock for the catastrophe. The result attracted enormous attention and appeared to strengthen the earlier scientific date. Yet the olive branch introduced problems of its own. Olive trees do not always produce annual growth rings as clearly or regularly as trees from cooler climates. Their trunks can grow unevenly, develop multiple centers, lose sections, or produce rings that are difficult to distinguish. Researchers debate whether the outermost preserved wood truly represents the final year of the tree's life. The branch may also have been dead for some time before burial, though its context suggests it was attached or closely associated with the living tree. No single explanation has ended the dispute. Other radiocarbon samples reduce dependence on the olive branch. Short-lived materials such as seeds and annual plants are especially valuable because they cannot contain decades of old growth. Groups of samples from Akrotiri and related Aegean sites generally continue to support an eruption date before the middle of the 16th century BCE. Statistical models combine multiple measurements and archaeological sequences to narrow the likely range. These analyses have increased confidence in the earlier chronology, but they have not convinced every specialist. Archaeologists traditionally built the date through pottery and connections with Egypt. Aegean ceramic styles change over time, and objects found together can establish relative sequences. Minoan pottery from before and after the eruption appears in Egyptian contexts that are linked to named rulers and dynasties. Egyptian history provides regnal lists, inscriptions, astronomical references, and administrative evidence that can be used to construct calendar dates. When these networks are aligned, the eruption seems to fall later than many radiocarbon results suggest. This system is not careless or arbitrary. It rests on decades of excavation and comparison across hundreds of sites. A particular vessel shape may appear in a securely dated Egyptian tomb. A related style appears in Crete, while another phase is found beneath Thera ash. By building chains of association, archaeologists place objects in chronological order. The difficulty is that imported pottery does not always arrive immediately after manufacture. A vessel can remain in use for years, be traded more than once, or be placed in a burial long after it was made. Egyptian chronology also contains uncertainties. Regnal lengths are not always known precisely. Some rulers may govern simultaneously in different regions, while others overlap through co-regencies. Ancient calendars do not align neatly with modern systems. Even a small adjustment to several reigns can shift the wider sequence. The Egyptian framework is far more detailed than anything surviving from Akrotiri, but it is not an immovable calendar free from interpretation. Tree ring evidence has offered another possible route. Major volcanic eruptions can produce climatic stress visible as unusually narrow growth rings or frost damage in trees far from the source. Researchers have identified severe growth disturbances around several possible dates in the 17th century BCE. Some have connected these to Thera, while others warn that a tree ring anomaly proves only that something affected the climate. Another volcano, a drought, unusual cold, or regional environmental stress could produce similar signals. Ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica contain layers of volcanic sulfate deposited after large eruptions. At first, strong sulfate signals near proposed dates seemed to offer a global marker for Thera. Later chemical analysis showed that some prominent layers probably came from other volcanoes. Identifying an eruption requires more than matching dates. The chemical composition of microscopic ash particles must correspond with Theran material. And many ice core layers contain no recoverable ash. The search has produced possibilities, but no universally accepted signature that resolves the chronology. Even distant historical records have entered the debate. Egyptian texts describing storms, darkness, flooding, or unusual weather have occasionally been linked to Thera. Chinese records of atmospheric disturbance and social crisis have also been mentioned in broader discussions of ancient eruptions. These connections are speculative. Descriptions may refer to ordinary storms, political metaphor, local floods, or completely unrelated volcanic events. Scholars still debate their meaning, and they cannot bear the weight of dating Thera by themselves. The argument matters because every proposed date changes the historical setting. An eruption in the later 17th century BCE occurs during one configuration of Egyptian power, Cretan palace development, and Eastern Mediterranean trade. A date closer to 1500 BCE places it beside a different sequence of rulers and political events. If the scientific date is correct, established pottery chronologies and cross-cultural links may require revision. If the archaeological date is correct, radiocarbon results must be explained through calibration, sampling, or contextual problems. Many researchers now favour the earlier scientific range, but no final consensus has closed the question. Improved calibration curves, new samples, better statistical methods, and fresh excavations continue to refine the possibilities. Each advance narrows some uncertainties while revealing others. The problem is not that one field follows evidence while another refuses it. Radiocarbon specialists, dendrochronologists, Egyptologists, ceramic experts, geologists, and archaeologists work with different records, each containing strengths and hidden weaknesses. Thera exposes the difficulty of constructing an exact calendar for a world without synchronized clocks. Archaeological time is assembled from damaged objects, tree growth, radioactive decay, king lists, trade goods, and layers of ash. These systems overlap, but they do not always fit cleanly. A difference of 50 or 70 years can survive because every method measures something slightly different. The eruption itself happened on one particular day. Pumice began falling, buildings collapsed, and the population of Akrotiri looked back toward an island disappearing beneath a dark column. That day had a season, a sunrise, and a position in the lives of real people. Yet its number within the modern calendar remains uncertain. The volcano preserved walls, food, colour, and furniture with extraordinary precision, while allowing its own date to escape. This unresolved chronology is fitting in one sense. Akrotiri survives as a place suspended between certainty and absence. Archaeologists know how people built their houses, but not what they called the town. They can reconstruct the eruption's phases, but not the final route of the evacuees. They can measure ash across the Mediterranean, but still debate the year it fell. And around these gaps, later generations have built stories larger than the evidence, including the most famous claim of all, that the shattered island preserved the memory of Atlantis. The idea that Thera might be Atlantis begins with a resemblance powerful enough to survive repeated criticism. An island civilization prospers through maritime wealth. Its buildings display remarkable sophistication. Its ships travel widely. Then earthquakes and volcanic destruction transform the landscape, and part of the island collapses beneath the sea. Centuries later, the Greek philosopher Plato describes Atlantis as a rich island power destroyed by earthquakes and floods in a single terrible interval. The temptation to join these stories is immediate. Akrotiri seems to offer a real place behind the legend, a Bronze Age city preserved beneath ash on the broken rim of a drowned volcanic caldera. Yet resemblance is not the same as evidence. Plato writes about Atlantis roughly 1,000 years after the eruption of Thera, and his account places the destruction thousands of years before his own lifetime. His Atlantis is described as a vast imperial state beyond the Pillars of Heracles, usually understood as the Strait of Gibraltar, not as a Cycladic island in the Aegean. It wages war against an idealized ancient Athens, possesses a highly structured political system, and serves a philosophical purpose within Plato's discussion of power, virtue, and corruption. Many classicists regard the story primarily as a moral and political invention rather than a preserved historical report. Supporters of a Theran connection argue that oral memories can travel across centuries, changing location, scale, and detail as they pass between cultures. A catastrophic eruption, collapsing island, strange darkness, and destructive waves could have generated stories repeated throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. Egyptian priests, sailors, refugees, or later Greek communities might have preserved fragments of the event. Plato could then have reshaped an inherited disaster tradition into his account of Atlantis. This is possible in the broadest sense, but possibility is difficult to test. No surviving chain of texts or oral traditions links Bronze Age Thera directly to Plato. The eruption may have contributed to later myths without being the sole source of any particular one. Ancient Mediterranean communities experience earthquakes, tsunamis, coastal subsidence, floods, and volcanic activity in many places. Stories of lands swallowed by the sea do not require one original catastrophe. Human memory naturally turns sudden landscape change into moral narrative. Cities are destroyed because rulers become arrogant, gods are offended, rituals fail. Or societies abandon proper order, disaster becomes easier to remember when given meaning. Akrotiri itself offers no evidence that its people considered their island a great imperial capital. The settlement is wealthy and connected, but no enormous palace, royal tomb, or military infrastructure has been found. Its political structure remains unknown. It may be one important port among several communities on Thera rather than the centre of a powerful state. The excavated district reveals sophistication, but it does not match Plato's detailed description of concentric harbours, vast armies and dominion over distant lands. Popular versions of the Atlantis theory often combine Akrotiri with Minoan Crete, treating the wider Minoan world as the powerful civilization behind the story, and Thera as the spectacular mechanism of its destruction. This produces a more impressive candidate, but it also merges separate places and historical processes. Crete is not swallowed by the sea. Minoan civilization survives the eruption and continues for generations. Its eventual political transformation involves Mycenaean expansion. Internal change, later destruction, and shifting trade networks. The volcano may contribute to that instability, but it does not erase the Minoans in a single day. The Atlantis comparison can therefore illuminate the human fascination with Akrotiri, but it cannot explain the site. When treated as established fact, it obscures more than it reveals. The real settlement is already extraordinary without a legendary name. Its paved streets, multi-story houses, drainage channels, painted rooms, storerooms, workshops, and maritime imagery belong to a documented Bronze Age community whose complexity can be studied directly. Replacing that community with Atlantis risks turning its inhabitants into characters from someone else's story. The surviving frescoes offer a more grounded form of memory. The flotilla fresco preserves ships moving through a populated seascape. The saffron gatherers preserve ceremonies whose meanings are partly lost. Dolphins, swallows, antelopes, monkeys, fishermen, and elaborately dressed women preserve a visual world shaped by local observation and distant contact. These images do not explain the eruption, but they show what the eruption interrupted. Akrotiri is important not because it might confirm a later legend, but because it allows the people who lived before the disaster to appear with unusual vividness. Even then, their world remains incomplete. The frescoes may represent elites and ceremonies rather than ordinary experience. The excavated buildings may belong to a prosperous quarter, poorer homes, farmsteads, burial places, harbour facilities, and other settlements may still lie beneath the pumice or sea. The absence of readable texts leaves names, offices, family histories, laws, and religious explanations beyond reach. What survives in the record suggests a society deeply connected to nature and maritime movement, but its own account of itself is silent. That silence creates the final contradiction of Akrotiri. The volcano preserves evidence more completely than centuries of peaceful occupation usually do, but the preservation depends on removal. For the buildings to survive, the residents must not return to repair, dismantle, or rebuild them. For wooden furniture to leave impressions, it must decay inside sealed ash. For paintings to retain colour, walls must collapse and bury them. The city becomes visible to the modern world because it disappears from the ancient one. The eruption also changes how later people understand volcanic disasters. Akrotiri demonstrates that catastrophe is not always an instant without warning. Earthquakes precede the main event. Residents clear streets, move possessions, sleep outside, and apparently evacuate. Their actions reveal perception, organization, and adaptation even without modern science. The absence of bodies is not evidence of luck alone. It suggests that communities can recognize escalating danger and respond before the final phase. Though the unknown fate of the evacuees prevents the story from becoming a simple triumph, modern volcanology gives Santorini's present inhabitants forms of warning unavailable in the Bronze Age. Scientists can monitor earthquakes, ground deformation, gas emissions, temperature changes, and the chemistry of volcanic systems. Instruments detect movement deep below the surface. Satellite measurements reveal subtle swelling or subsidence. Emergency planning can identify evacuation routes and danger zones, yet prediction remains uncertain. A restless volcano can produce signals without erupting, while the exact timing and scale of future activity cannot be guaranteed. Santorini remains active. Later eruptions build the small islands of Playa Kameni and Nea Kameni within the caldera. Lava emerges repeatedly during historical times, reminding residents that the volcanic system did not end with the Bronze Age catastrophe. The white villages, vineyards, hotels, roads, and churches of the modern island occupy another temporary arrangement of the same restless landscape. The caldera appears timeless to visitors, but geologically it is a moment between transformations. The vineyards themselves offer a quiet continuity. Grapes grow in volcanic soil under dry winds, often trained close to the ground in basket-like forms that protect them from harsh conditions. Modern agriculture differs from Bronze Age practice, but it still depends on careful adaptation to limited water, strong winds, porous soil, and the island's unusual geology. The volcano that once made Thera uninhabitable eventually produces soil in which life returns. Destruction and fertility remain intertwined. Akrotiri's conservation presents another form of fragility. Once excavated, walls that survived beneath ash for millennia are exposed to air, humidity, temperature changes, vibration, and human presence. Frescoes must be stabilized. Masonry must be supported. The shelter above the site must protect without creating new risks. Every newly opened room increases knowledge while creating a permanent obligation. Archaeologists must decide not only where to dig, but where to stop. Much of the settlement remains sealed. Beneath unexcavated ground may lie the evidence that resolves central mysteries, additional written signs. Public buildings, harbour structures, burial grounds, or victims who failed to leave. There may be evidence of the evacuation's organisation or objects identifying links to particular foreign ports. There may also be only more houses, jars, workshops, and paintings, each expanding the picture without providing a final answer. Archaeology rarely closes mysteries as neatly as stories do. The larger legacy of Thera lies in that refusal to become simple. The eruption is both sudden and prolonged, local and far-reaching, destructive and preservative. It damages the Minoan world without clearly ending it. It generates tsunamis without striking every coastline equally. It may affect climate without producing the universal darkness imagined in popular accounts. It empties Akrotiri without revealing where the population goes. It leaves a date that science can narrow but not yet settle beyond dispute. The Bronze Age world preserved beneath the volcano is not frozen at the exact instant of ordinary life. It is preserved during a sequence of crisis. Walls already bear earthquake damage. Possessions have been moved. Valuables are missing. Repair work has begun and stopped. The town is therefore not a perfect photograph of a peaceful civilization before disaster. It is something more, revealing a record of people realizing that their environment has changed, attempting to adapt, and finally abandoning what generations had built. That is why Akrotiri endures so strongly in the imagination. It does not merely display beautiful ancient objects. It preserves the moment when permanence fails. A stone house appears durable until the ground moves. A full storeroom promises security until the island becomes uninhabitable. A fleet opens the world until ash darkens the sea. Trade, art, technology, and social order create resilience. But none can guarantee survival when the landscape itself is transformed. Still, the story is not only about helplessness. The people of Akrotiri seem to have responded. They cleared debris, salvaged possessions, avoided damaged buildings, and left before the town was sealed. Their knowledge was incomplete, but not useless. The final empty streets preserve evidence of human judgment operating under uncertainty. Whatever happened after departure, the evacuation remains one of the most important facts in the archaeological record. No inscription gives the last word. No survivor's account describes the final view from a departing boat. There is only the material sequence: tremors, repairs, abandonment, pumice, ash, collapse, silence, and discovery. Atlantis belongs to literature. Akrotiri belongs to the earth, and the earth preserves a stranger, more restrained story than legend, a prosperous community that read the warnings of a restless island, vanished from its houses, and left its entire world behind. The streets remain beneath the shelter now, pale and still. Visitors look down into rooms that once contained heat, voices, food, smoke, work, argument, ceremony, and sleep. Painted swallows continue crossing walls without ever reaching another season. Ships remain suspended on a plaster sea. Crocuses bloom in rooms where sunlight did not enter for thousands of years. Beyond the excavation, the caldera opens toward the horizon. Its cliffs expose layer after layer of volcanic time, each band marking an island destroyed, rebuilt, and altered again. Boats move across the water where parts of the Bronze Age landscape once stood. The distance between the living harbour and the buried city is small, yet it contains more than 3 millennia of forgetting and return. Civilizations often imagine that their streets, ports, houses, and systems will continue because they continued yesterday. Akrotiri offers no accusation against that belief. Its people are not foolish for building on fertile ground, trading across the sea, or trusting houses reinforced against earthquakes. Human life has always depended on landscapes that provide opportunity while containing danger. The island feeds the community, connects it to the world, and ultimately destroys the conditions that made its prosperity possible. In the end, the volcano preserves no grand declaration, only ordinary things: a jar beside a wall, the hollow shape of a bed, grain that was never eaten, tools put down during interrupted work, and painted figures moving forever through a world without ash. These traces survive because time was denied the chance to erase them slowly. The people themselves pass beyond identification. Perhaps they reach Crete or another Cycladic island. Perhaps some die along the coast or at sea. Perhaps their descendants carry stories of Thera for generations before the memories blend with other disasters and other lost lands. Their names are gone, but the spaces they shaped remain close enough to enter. And so the city rests inside the volcano's final paradox. The eruption takes away its future and protects its past. It destroys the island people knew and creates the conditions under which their rooms can be seen again. Beneath the pumice, Akrotiri waits without movement, holding the colours of a vanished morning while the living world above it changes century after century. The caldera grows quiet. Evening settles across the water, the cliffs darken, the white villages fade into the distance, and the sea occupies the hollow left by fire. Far below the modern paths, the Bronze Age streets remain where the inhabitants last left them, leading between sealed houses toward a shoreline that no longer exists. Nothing returns exactly as it was. Landscapes change, societies scatter, and memory becomes uncertain. Yet sometimes destruction leaves a shape behind a room, a painting, an empty doorway through which the vanished world can still be approached. Akrotiri is such a doorway, opened not by survival, but by burial, and waiting beneath the ash long enough for the future to find it.